Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a time when darkness didn't just fall outside the house. It slowly crept inside, filling every crack in the walls, settling into the straw beneath your body, and whispering softly in the last glow of a dying fire. Tonight, we're not just visiting the Middle Ages, we're staying inside a medieval home after nightfall, and we're not leaving until morning. As the sun slipped below the horizon, life didn't just quiet down, it changed completely. Daylight was safety, visibility, control. But night was something else entirely. It was unpredictable, heavy, and strangely alive. A simple home that felt ordinary during the day could become something unfamiliar once the light disappeared. Picture a small wooden house, its walls uneven and rough, built from timber that still carried the scent of the forest it came from. The floor wasn't really a floor as we think of it, just packed earth, sometimes covered with straw or rushes that had been there far longer than anyone cared to admit. In the center of the room burned a fire, not in a modern fireplace, but often in a simple hearth, sometimes with a hole in the roof above to let the smoke escape. Though it rarely worked as intended, that fire was everything. It was light, heat, comfort, and protection. Without it, the night pressed in hard. So as darkness took over, the entire household naturally drew closer to it. Family members gathered in a loose circle, sitting, crouching, or leaning into one another. The glow of the flames painted their faces in flickering orange, stretching shadows across the walls that moved in ways that could easily trick the eye. Outside, there was no safety net, no streetlights, no distant glow from a nearby town, just darkness. Deep, absolute darkness, broken only by the stars, and whatever sounds drifted in from beyond the walls. A barking dog, the distant howl of something larger, the wind moving through trees like a slow, restless breath. Inside, light was limited and precious. Candles existed, but they weren't something most people could afford to waste. Wealthier households might burn beeswax candles, which gave off a cleaner, steadier light. But most people relied on tallow candles made from animal fat. They smoked, they smelled, and they didn't last long. So more often than not, once the fire dimmed, the house dimmed with it, and the fire itself was never entirely safe. Too little fuel, and it would die out, leaving the home bitterly cold. Too much, or a misplaced ember, and the entire structure, dry wood, straw, cloth, could go up in flames. Fires at night were a constant risk, which meant someone in the household was often only half asleep, aware of the shifting glow, ready to react if something went wrong. The air inside the house was thick. Smoke didn't just vanish up through the roof, it lingered, curling into every corner, clinging to clothes, hair, and lungs. Breathing it in night after night was simply part of life. No one thought of it as unusual. It was just how things were. Dinner, if it hadn't already been eaten, was simple and shared. Bread, maybe some vegetables, possibly a bit of salted meat if fortune allowed it. There were no individual plates laid out neatly people ate together, often from the same dish, passing food by hand. The act itself was quiet, practical, without ceremony. As the meal ended, conversation softened. The energy of the day drained away, replaced by something slower. This was when stories came out, not the kind of stories meant to inspire adventure, but the kind meant to explain the unknown, or at least make it feel contained. Older members of the household would speak of spirits, of strange figures seen at the edge of forests, of things that moved when no one was watching. These weren't just tales for entertainment, they were warnings, shaped by a world where the line between reality and belief was far less defined. Because once you stepped outside at night, you were stepping into something you couldn't fully understand. Sleeping arrangements were basic at best. There were no separate bedrooms for most people, no sense of privacy as we think of it today. Everyone slept in the same space, often close together. Straw mattresses, if they could even be called that, were laid out on the ground. They were uneven, scratchy, and alive in ways no one would be comfortable with now. Fleas, lice, and other insects were constant companions in the dark. But closeness had its purpose. Bodies shared warmth. In winter, that wasn't just comfort, it was survival. And sleep itself didn't happen the way it does today. People didn't simply lie down and disappear into 8 uninterrupted hours of rest. Instead, they slept in 2 distinct phases. The first sleep would come not long after darkness settled in. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, they would wake. Not abruptly, not in panic, just awake. This period, sometimes lasting an hour or more, was strangely calm. The fire would be low, the room dim, the world outside completely still. Some people would pray. Others would sit quietly thinking or speak in hushed voices. It was a time that felt separate from both day and night, almost like existing in between. Then, eventually, they would return to sleep again. The second sleep, until morning light slowly brought the world back into focus. But that middle stretch of the night, that was when things felt different. With the fire nearly gone, shadows took over. They stretched longer, moved slower, sometimes appearing to shift even when nothing had changed. The mind, half rested and half dreaming, could easily fill in the gaps. A shape in the corner might not stay just a shape for long. Medieval people believed night belonged to other things. Spirits, creatures, forces that didn't show themselves in daylight. Doors were secured carefully before sleep. Not just to keep out thieves, but to keep out whatever else might wander too close. Protective symbols were sometimes carved or placed near entrances. Charms, simple and handmade, might hang nearby. These weren't seen as superstitions. They were practical precautions in a world where the unseen felt very real. And the sounds didn't help. At night, even the smallest noise could feel amplified. The creak of wood as the house shifted in the cold. Scratching from inside the walls where mice moved unseen. a sudden thud from the roof. Each sound had to be interpreted in the dark, without certainty. Was it just the house settling, or something else? Winter nights were the harshest. The cold didn't just stay outside, it seeped through walls, into bones. Even with a fire, even with shared body heat, people could feel it constantly. Breath turned visible in the air. Water left out might freeze by morning. Sleep came, but never deeply enough to forget the cold entirely. Summer brought its own discomfort. Heat, thick and unmoving, filled the room. Insects slipped in through every opening, drawn by warmth and the faint glow of embers. Sleep became restless, interrupted, sticky. Hygiene, as we understand it, wasn't part of the nightly routine. Bodies carried the day with them, sweat, dirt, the lingering presence of animals that often shared the same space. The smell inside the house was layered and constant. Smoke, earth, fabric, and life itself, all mixed together. And yet this was normal. This was simply how nights were lived. There was no expectation of silence, no perfect comfort, no complete sense of security. And still, within all of it, there was a kind of quiet rhythm, a slow acceptance. People adjusted, adapted, found small ways to feel at ease. They watched the fire, they listened, they drifted, and eventually, one by one, they slipped back into sleep. But in those moments, when the house fell completely still, when the last ember dimmed and shadows swallowed the room, there were times when something felt off. Not loud, not obvious, just different enough to make someone's eyes open in the dark. And what happened in those moments? The first thing you notice, once you're awake in that deep stretch of night, is how complete the silence feels. It's not truly silent, of course. There are always small sounds, but they exist in a way that feels distant, separated from you. The breathing of others in the room becomes louder, slower, uneven at times. Someone shifts slightly on the straw, causing a faint rustle that seems far more noticeable than it should. Your eyes adjust slowly, but there isn't much to see. The fire has nearly died, leaving behind a faint, pulsing glow that barely outlines the shapes in the room. In this half-awake state, the mind begins to play strange tricks. Familiar objects lose their certainty. A wooden stool near the wall looks taller than it should, its shadow stretching in a way that doesn't quite make sense. A hanging cloth moves slightly, though you're not sure if there's any wind at all. It's in these moments that the boundary between what is real and what is imagined begins to blur, not dramatically, but subtly, quietly enough that you question your own certainty. For many people in the medieval world, waking at this hour wasn't unusual, but what they felt during it could vary. Some described a calm stillness, a peaceful pause between sleeps. Others, though, spoke of a weight in the room. Not a physical weight exactly, but something harder to explain, a presence that seemed to exist just beyond the reach of the firelight. It wasn't something they could point to, but it was something they felt. If you were lying there, staring into the dimness, you might begin to listen more carefully. Outside, the wind shifts direction, brushing against the walls with a low, steady sound. Somewhere in the distance, an animal calls out a sharp, sudden noise that fades as quickly as it came. These sounds were normal, expected even. But in the middle of the night, with your body still caught between sleep and waking, they took on a different quality. Inside the house, the smallest noises could become unsettling. The wood beams above might creak as the temperature drops, contracting in slow, uneven movements. From within the walls, faint scratching could be heard. Mice or other small creatures going about their own nightly routines. These sounds weren't hidden. They were constant. But awareness of them, in this quiet hour, made them feel amplified. There were also moments when the silence returned too suddenly. After a sound, after movement, everything would go still again, almost as if the house itself was holding its breath. That sudden absence could feel heavier than any noise. It left space for the imagination to fill, and the imagination, especially at night, rarely chose the simplest explanation. Some medieval accounts describe a feeling of being watched during these hours, not in a clear, defined way, but as a lingering sensation that someone or something was present. It didn't always come with fear at first. Sometimes it was just awareness, a sense that you were no longer entirely alone in your thoughts, even if everyone else in the room was still asleep. You might turn your head slightly, careful not to disturb the others. The shapes around you remain still. The outlines of bodies under rough blankets, the low curve of the hearth, the dark stretch of the doorway. Nothing moves. And yet, the feeling doesn't immediately fade. It stays, just long enough to make you question whether it was ever there at all. For people at the time, these experiences often had explanations that made sense within their world. Night was believed to be a time when unseen things could move more freely. Spirits, restless or otherwise, were thought to wander. Not always with harmful intent, but not always harmless either. The idea that the night belonged partly to something other than the living was deeply rooted. This belief shaped how people reacted to what they felt. A sudden chill might not be dismissed as a draft. A strange noise might not be ignored as settling wood. Instead, these things were interpreted carefully, often cautiously. It wasn't about panic. It was about awareness, about recognizing that the world, especially at night, held more than what could be seen. There were also physical sensations that added to this experience. Waking in the middle of the night, the body could feel heavy, slow to respond. Sometimes people reported being unable to move right away, as if sleep still held them in place. Their eyes would be open, their minds alert, but their bodies uncooperative. In that state, even the smallest shadow could take on a much stronger presence. This kind of experience, which we might now understand differently, was often interpreted as something external, something pressing down, holding the body still. Stories of night visitors, of unseen figures sitting at the edge of a bed or lying heavily across the chest, were not uncommon. They were described in quiet tones, passed along as warnings or shared experiences. Back in the dim interior of the house, the fire finally gives one last shift. A small piece of wood collapses inward, sending up a brief flicker of light. For a second, the room becomes clearer, the walls, the faces, the shapes all snapping back into familiarity. And then, just as quickly, it fades again, returning everything to shadow. That brief moment of light can be strangely reassuring. It confirms that the world is still as it should be, that nothing has changed, that whatever was felt before might have only been a trick of the mind. But reassurance in the night is often temporary. Once the light fades, the questions tend to return. Time moves differently in these hours. Without a clear sense of progression, minutes can feel longer, stretched out in the quiet. Eventually, though, the body begins to settle again. The heaviness of sleep returns, pulling gently at your awareness. The sounds fade back into the background, becoming part of the rhythm once more. And so, slowly, almost without noticing the exact moment, you drift back into sleep. But not every night passes so smoothly. There are times, rare, but remembered, when the feeling doesn't fade, when the silence doesn't return to normal, when something small, almost unnoticeable, shifts just enough to be remembered in the morning. A moved object, a door not quite as it was left, a story that someone hesitates to tell in full. And those are the nights that stayed with people, not because something clearly happened, but because something might have. By the time the second sleep begins to pull at the edges of your awareness again, the house has settled into a deeper kind of stillness. The earlier noises fade into something softer, more distant, as if the world itself has grown tired. Your body wants to drift, but your mind lingers just a little longer, caught in that fragile space where thoughts feel slower and heavier. The faint glow of the hearth pulses once, then dims further, leaving only a suggestion of light behind. Somewhere nearby, a sleeper murmurs in their dreams. It's quiet, almost unintelligible, but enough to remind you that you are not alone. Their voice fades as quickly as it came, replaced by the soft rhythm of breathing that fills the room again. Each inhale, each exhale, becomes part of the background, steady and grounding. And yet, there's always that awareness, that thin thread of alertness that refuses to disappear completely. Your eyes close, but not fully. Shadows still linger behind your eyelids, shifting in ways that feel almost deliberate. The mind, still active, begins to shape them into something recognizable. A figure, perhaps, or the outline of a face. Nothing holds its form for long, but the impressions come and go, leaving behind a faint unease that's hard to explain. Outside, the night continues its slow movement. The wind presses gently against the structure, slipping through unseen gaps, carrying with it the distant scent of damp earth and wood. Occasionally, it changes direction, causing a subtle shift in sound that makes the house creak in response. These movements are natural, expected, but in the quiet, they feel purposeful. At times, It almost seems like the house itself is responding to something beyond it. Inside, the temperature drops further. The warmth from the fire has nearly vanished, and the cold begins to settle in more firmly. It creeps through layers of cloth, pressing lightly against skin, making stillness less comfortable. Someone pulls a covering closer, the fabric brushing softly against straw. Another shifts, adjusting their position without fully waking. These small movements ripple through the shared space, subtle but noticeable. If you were to open your eyes again, you might notice something strange, not something obvious, not something that demands attention, but something just slightly out of place. The doorway, for instance, might seem darker than before, not just shadowed, but deeper somehow, as if the darkness there has more weight than the rest of the room. You blink, and it looks the same as it always has. Moments like this were difficult to describe, even for those who experienced them. There was no clear event, no distinct figure to point to, just a feeling that something had shifted briefly before returning to normal. And yet, the memory of it would linger quietly in the back of the mind. In the medieval world, such moments often found their place in shared understanding. People didn't always question whether something had happened. They focused more on what it might mean. A restless night, a strange sensation, an unusual silence. These were sometimes seen as signs, subtle indications that something unseen had passed close by. Not everyone interpreted these experiences the same way. Some dismissed them as dreams bleeding into waking life, the natural confusion of a tired mind. Others, however, were less certain. They carried these moments with them into the daylight, mentioning them cautiously, watching how others reacted, because sometimes someone else had felt it too. A brief pause in conversation the next morning, a glance exchanged across the room. No one saying exactly what they were thinking, but all of them aware that the night had not been entirely ordinary. These shared uncertainties were rarely spoken of in detail, but they were understood. Back in the quiet of the house, the night stretches on. Time feels suspended, neither moving forward nor standing still. The absence of clear markers, no clocks, no distant activity, makes it impossible to measure. There is only the slow progression from darkness toward the faint promise of light that will eventually come. And then, without warning, a sound breaks through. It's not loud, not sudden enough to startle fully awake, but different. Perhaps it's a soft tap, like something lightly brushing against wood, or a faint shift near the edge of the room, too small to identify clearly. It happens once, then stops. You listen, waiting for it to repeat, but it doesn't. The silence that follows feels thicker than before, as if it's pressing in more closely. You tell yourself it's nothing. The house settles. The wind moves. Something small has fallen or shifted or passed by unnoticed. These are the explanations that make sense. These are the explanations that allow sleep to return. And yet, For a moment longer, you stay still, listening, waiting. Eventually, the body gives in. The need for rest overrides the uncertainty, and you slip once more into sleep. This time deeper, heavier, less interrupted. The mind lets go, releasing its hold on the strange impressions of the night. But not all traces disappear. By the time morning begins to approach, the darkness changes. It doesn't lift all at once. Instead, it softens. The edges of objects become slightly clearer, the blackness turning to a muted gray. The doorway no longer seems as deep. The corners of the room feel less distant. The world returns slowly. Someone wakes first, as they always do. There's a quiet movement as they sit up, careful not to disturb the others. The routine begins again, small, practiced actions carried out in near silence. The fire is stirred, coaxed back to life with whatever fuel remains. A faint glow grows into something steadier, more reliable. With light comes certainty. The shapes in the room settle back into their familiar forms. The stool is just a stool. The cloth hangs still. The doorway is empty. Whatever uncertainty existed during the night fades in the presence of morning, replaced by the practical concerns of the day ahead. But memory doesn't vanish so easily. As the others begin to wake, there may be a moment brief, almost unnoticeable, where someone hesitates. A pause before speaking. A thought they choose not to share. Because explaining what was felt in the night is never simple and rarely satisfying. So most of the time, they don't try. The day moves forward. Tasks begin. The rhythm of life resumes as if nothing unusual had happened. And for the most part, nothing had. The house stands as it always does. The world outside continues without interruption. But as evening approaches once again, and the light begins to fade, there is often a quiet awareness that returns with it. Night is coming back, and with it, that same uncertain space between sleep and waking, where the ordinary doesn't always feel quite so ordinary. As evening returns and the last light of day begins to fade again, there's a subtle shift in the way people move inside the home. It's not rushed, not panicked, just quieter, more deliberate. Tasks that seemed simple in daylight now carry a slight urgency. Water is brought in, tools are set aside, animals are secured. Everyone understands, without needing to say it, that once darkness settles fully, going outside becomes something to avoid unless absolutely necessary. The fire is built up again, carefully this time, as if preparing for a long and uncertain stretch. Dry wood is placed with intention, arranged so it will last as long as possible through the night. Someone crouches close, adjusting embers, blowing gently until the flames respond. The glow strengthens, pushing back the early shadows that gather at the edges of the room. Dinner comes and goes in much the same way as before, shared, simple, practical. But there's a difference in the air tonight, something so faint it might be imagined. Conversation doesn't flow as easily. Words are shorter, pauses slightly longer. No one points it out, but it lingers there, just beneath the surface. Outside, the sky deepens into darkness once again. The stars appear, sharp and distant, offering no real comfort to those inside. The world beyond the walls disappears into blackness, and with it, any clear sense of what lies just out of sight. The door is checked, then checked again, secured firmly against whatever might pass by in the night. Inside, people begin to settle down. Bodies lower onto straw, blankets are pulled close, and the fire becomes the final focus of attention. Its light flickers across tired faces, reflecting in half-closed eyes. One by one, voices fade, replaced by the steady rhythm of breathing that fills the room. But sleep doesn't come all at once. It arrives slowly, unevenly, as if the mind resists letting go too quickly. Thoughts linger longer than they should. Small details from the day replay themselves, blending with fragments of memory and imagination. The fire crackles softly, each sound marking the quiet passage of time. Eventually, the first sleep takes hold. The room settles into stillness, but it's not complete. There are always movements, subtle shifts, small adjustments, the natural restlessness of sleeping bodies. The fire burns lower, its light dimming gradually, until it becomes a faint glow rather than a steady flame. Then comes the waking. It happens without warning, without reason. Your eyes open into the dark, and for a moment, you don't move. The world feels paused, suspended in a kind of quiet that's almost too complete. You listen, not because you expect something, but because the silence demands it. At first, everything seems as it should be. The breathing of others, the faint creak of wood, the distant whisper of wind. Familiar sounds, predictable, grounding. But then, something changes, not in a clear or obvious way, but just enough to shift your awareness. A gap in the pattern, a moment where the rhythm feels interrupted. You can't immediately identify what's different, only that something is. Your attention sharpens slightly, your senses reaching out into the darkness, trying to make sense of it. The fire gives a faint pulse of light, revealing nothing unusual. And yet, the feeling remains. You turn your head slowly, careful not to disturb anyone. The shapes in the room are still, unchanged. The doorway is dark, as it should be. The walls stand silent, their rough surfaces catching only the smallest traces of light. But the silence feels heavier now, not empty, but filled with something undefined. This is the kind of moment that lingers in memory, not because of what is seen, but because of what is felt. A subtle awareness that the night is not entirely passive, that it holds its own quiet presence within the walls of the house. In the medieval world, these sensations weren't easily dismissed. People didn't always separate feeling from reality in the way we might now. If something felt different, it meant something had changed, even if that change couldn't be clearly explained. And so, the mind begins to search for meaning. not wildly, not in panic, but in a slow, cautious way. It reaches into what it knows: stories, beliefs, shared understandings of how the world works. Night is not just the absence of day. It is a time when other things move, other forces exist just beyond sight. You remain still, listening. Then another sound, this time slightly clearer. A faint scrape, as if something has shifted against the wall or floor. It's brief, almost delicate, but enough to confirm that the earlier feeling wasn't imagined. Something has moved. Again, the silence follows. Longer now, heavier. You wait, expecting it to happen again. Your body stays still, your breath shallow, as if even the act of breathing might disturb whatever is unfolding. The seconds stretch, each one feeling longer than the last, but nothing else comes. Eventually, the tension eases, just slightly. The mind begins to offer explanations once more. A loose piece of wood settling. A small animal moving through the structure. Something simple, something ordinary. And yet, certainty doesn't fully return, because the feeling remains. Not as strong as before, but present. A quiet awareness at the edge of thought, refusing to disappear completely. It's enough to keep you from fully relaxing, enough to delay the return to sleep. Across the room, someone else shifts. It's subtle but noticeable. A small movement, a change in position. You glance in that direction, but it's too dark to see clearly. Still, the timing feels connected, as if they, too, have sensed something, even if only in their sleep. This shared space, filled with quiet breathing and unmoving shapes, suddenly feels less predictable, less certain. Time passes, though it's impossible to know how much. The fire dims further, the room growing colder, darker. The boundaries between objects blur, leaving only vague outlines in the near-total darkness. And slowly, almost reluctantly, your body begins to give in again. Sleep returns, not all at once, but in waves. Awareness fades, then lingers, then fades again. The sounds soften, the feelings dull, the questions lose their sharpness, until finally they disappear. Morning will come, as it always does. The light will return, and with it, the reassurance of clarity. Whatever was felt in the night will seem less important, less real, easier to ignore. But for now, in this moment, lying in the dark, with only the faintest glow of dying embers, the night still holds its secrets, and it hasn't finished yet. As the night deepens further, there's a point where everything feels suspended, as if time itself has slowed to almost nothing. The fire is no longer a flame, just a bed of faintly glowing embers that pulse weakly, giving off barely enough light to separate shadow from darkness. The air has grown colder, sharper somehow, and every breath feels more noticeable in the quiet. Sleep should have taken over completely by now, but it hasn't. Not fully. There's still that thin thread of awareness, stretched between rest and waking. It keeps you just present enough to notice the smallest changes, the faintest disruptions in the stillness around you. And then, without warning, it happens again. A sound, but different this time. Not the soft settling of wood or the distant call of an animal. This is closer. Inside the house. A slight pressure against the floor, followed by a pause. It's so faint that, for a moment, you wonder if it was part of a dream you've already begun to slip into. But your eyes open, fully this time. The darkness hasn't changed, but your awareness has. You're listening now, completely still, every sense focused on the space around you. The breathing of others continues, slow and steady, unaware. No one else reacts. For a few seconds, nothing happens. Then again, a subtle shift, like weight being transferred carefully, deliberately. Not enough to make a clear sound, but enough to disturb the silence in a way that feels intentional. Your body tenses slightly, though you don't move. Instinct tells you to stay still, to listen, to understand before reacting. The mind begins its quiet work again, searching for explanation. It could be an animal. That's the simplest answer. Mice move through walls, across floors, unnoticed most of the time. They're part of the house as much as the wood and straw. But this feels heavier, slower, more measured. The doorway sits in darkness, unchanged to the eye, but somehow different in presence. It draws your attention without reason, pulling your focus toward it, as if something there is just beyond recognition. You blink, trying to clear your vision. Nothing, and yet the feeling remains. There's a moment, brief, but sharp, where it feels as though the darkness itself has depth. Not just empty space, but something layered, something that could be stepped into. It's an impossible thought, and yet it lingers just long enough to make your breath catch slightly. From across the room, a sleeper exhales more sharply than before, shifting in their place. The movement breaks the tension for a second, reminding you of the ordinary world, the shared space, the presence of others. But as quickly as it comes, that reassurance fades again, because the sound returns. Closer. This time it's unmistakable, a faint brush against the ground, like something passing over the straw. Slow, careful, almost cautious. It doesn't rush. It doesn't stumble. It moves with a strange kind of control. You remain frozen, eyes fixed on the dark. Your heartbeat feels louder now, though you're not sure if it actually is, or if the silence has simply made it more noticeable. Every instinct is alert, every thought focused on understanding what's happening without drawing attention to yourself. And still, no one else wakes. The fire shifts slightly, one ember collapsing inward, sending up the faintest flicker of light. For just a moment, the room becomes visible again, soft outlines, familiar shapes, nothing out of place. Then the light fades, and the darkness returns, deeper than before. Whatever moved is no longer where it was, or at least not where you expected it to be. The feeling changes then, Not stronger, not weaker, just different. Less like something approaching, and more like something already there. Present, still, waiting in a way that doesn't quite make sense, but feels undeniable. You listen again, but the sound is gone, replaced by silence, so complete it feels almost unnatural. This is the moment where fear might take hold, but it doesn't, not fully, not in the way we might imagine. Instead, there's a quiet tension, a focused awareness that holds everything in place. You don't move, not because you're afraid to, but because movement feels unnecessary, like it would break something delicate in the air. Minutes pass, or seconds. It's impossible to tell. Eventually, the body begins to resist this state. The stillness becomes uncomfortable. Muscles ache slightly from holding position. The cold presses in further, demanding attention. The mind, unable to maintain its heightened awareness forever, begins to soften at the edges, and slowly, carefully, you allow yourself to relax. Just a little, your breathing deepens again. Your eyes close, not tightly, but enough to break the constant strain of looking into darkness. The sounds of the house return to their familiar pattern, filling in the silence with something recognizable. Nothing moves, nothing happens, and yet the memory of those moments doesn't fade. Even as sleep finally takes over, pulling you down into a deeper, more complete rest, something lingers. Not a clear image, not a definite event, but a sensation, a quiet certainty that, for a brief stretch of the night, the world inside that small house was not entirely as it seemed. Morning will come, and with it, the return of light, warmth, and routine. But that feeling, it will remain just beneath the surface, waiting to be remembered, because nights like this don't stand out in obvious ways. They don't leave clear marks or undeniable proof. They exist in the edges of experience, in the spaces between certainty and doubt. And that's what makes them unforgettable. As the first faint light of dawn begins to seep into the world outside, the darkness inside the house starts to loosen its grip. It doesn't vanish all at once, but it changes, softening, retreating, becoming something less solid, less absolute. The doorway no longer feels as deep. The corners of the room begin to take shape again. The space returns to what it always was. Someone stirs, then another. The quiet rhythm of sleep breaks apart, replaced by the slow, familiar movements of waking life. A hand reaches out, adjusting a blanket. A body shifts, stretching slightly against the stiffness of the night. The fire is stirred back into life, its glow growing stronger, pushing the last shadows away. And just like that, everything feels normal again. No sign of movement, no trace of anything unusual. The floor remains undisturbed. The walls stand silent. The air, though still cold, carries no hint of what may have passed through it hours before. It would be easy to forget, easy to dismiss the night as nothing more than imagination. a half-dream shaped by darkness and fatigue. And for most people, that's exactly what they did, because daylight has a way of simplifying things. It strips away uncertainty, replaces it with clarity, turns strange moments into ordinary ones. What felt real in the night becomes questionable in the morning. What seemed important fades into something insignificant, but not completely, because sometimes, as the day goes on, there's a pause, a brief moment where someone stops, just for a second, as if recalling something they can't quite place. A feeling, not a thought. A memory without detail. And then they move on. The work begins again. The routine continues. Life carries forward, unchanged on the surface. But as the sun begins its slow descent once more, and shadows start to stretch across the land again, there's always that quiet understanding. Night is coming back, and with it, the possibility that something, however small, however uncertain, might return with it. As daylight slowly fades once again, the medieval household begins its familiar transition into evening. But now something subtle has changed in how people carry themselves. There is a quiet attentiveness in their movements, a slight hesitation before stepping outside or letting the light fully disappear from the room. The memory of the previous night doesn't exist as a story. It exists as a feeling, unspoken but understood. No one references it directly, yet it influences everything from the way doors are secured to how close people sit near the fire. The hearth is prepared earlier this time, almost instinctively. Wood is gathered with more care, stacked in a way that suggests preparation for something longer than just ordinary nightfall. The flames are encouraged to grow stronger before darkness fully arrives, as if trying to delay the moment when the house will once again belong entirely to shadows. Light becomes not just comfort, but reassurance against uncertainty that no one fully names. Dinner feels slightly more structured tonight. People eat with less distraction, more focus on the act itself. Conversations are shorter, sometimes ending before they fully begin. There is nothing openly wrong, yet the atmosphere carries a kind of quiet expectation, as though everyone is unconsciously waiting for something familiar, but unwelcome to return. Even the smallest sounds inside the house draw brief attention before being dismissed. Outside, the final light of day drains from the sky, leaving behind a deep blue that quickly turns into black. The boundary between visible world and unknown space dissolves faster than it feels natural. Trees become silhouettes, then disappear entirely. The land beyond the house ceases to feel distant, and instead feels simply absent, as if it no longer exists in any reliable form. Inside, the fire grows into the dominant presence again. Shadows return to the walls, but this time they seem less playful, more defined. The room feels smaller in darkness, as if the walls have subtly moved inward. People settle into their sleeping positions earlier than before, as though agreeing, without speaking, that it is better to be unconscious before the night fully deepens. Sleep begins its slow descent again, but it is not as smooth as before. There is a slight resistance, a hesitation in the body, as if it remembers something it does not fully understand. Eyes close, thoughts drift, but awareness does not vanish completely. It lingers in fragments, catching on small sensations, the shift of air, the faint crack of wood, the uneven rhythm of breathing nearby. The first sleep arrives unevenly, scattered across the room like falling pieces of time. Some fall into it quickly, while others remain half aware for longer, suspended between rest and alertness. The fire dims steadily, reducing the room to a softer, less defined space. And once again, the world outside becomes irrelevant, replaced entirely by the enclosed reality of the house. Then the deeper stillness returns. It begins, as it always does, with silence that feels too complete. Not peaceful, not empty, simply absolute. The kind of silence that makes even thought feel slower. Breathing becomes the only reliable rhythm, but even that seems distant, as if belonging to someone else. The body lies still, but the mind does not fully disconnect. And in that space, awareness returns again, not sharply, not suddenly, but gradually, like something rising from below the surface of sleep. The eyes open without urgency, adjusting to darkness that feels unchanged, but somehow heavier than before. The fire is nearly gone now, leaving behind a dim, unstable glow that barely outlines anything. At first, everything appears normal. The same shapes, the same quiet, the same sleeping figures scattered across the room. But attention, once awake, begins to search without intention. It scans the space not because something is expected, but because something feels unresolved. And slowly, that sense returns, the same subtle dissonance from before. A gap in stillness, a pause in the pattern of silence. It is not obvious. Nothing is seen. Nothing is clearly heard. And yet, the awareness of it is unmistakable. The mind tries to define it, to assign it meaning, but fails to attach it to anything concrete. It exists only as a sensation of not quite right. The doorway draws attention again, not because it has changed, but because it feels like it holds something that the rest of the room does not. The darkness there seems denser, not visually, but perceptually, like it absorbs more than it should. It is impossible to explain in rational terms, and yet it resists dismissal. Then, very faintly, something shifts. Not a clear movement, not a sound that can be confidently identified. More like the suggestion of motion, just at the edge of perception. The kind of thing that disappears when focused on directly. The mind attempts to follow it, but it dissolves immediately, leaving behind only doubt. Stillness returns, but it is no longer neutral. It feels aware of itself, as if the room is holding its breath. Even the sleeping figures seem more fragile in their stillness, as if they could wake at any moment without reason. The fire gives a weak pulse of light, then settles again into near darkness. Time becomes difficult to track. There is no sense of progression, only continuation. Seconds stretch without structure. The mind drifts between observation and imagination, unable to fully commit to either. Every small sound, if it happens, feels significant, yet nothing repeats enough to confirm certainty. Then comes the moment that cannot be ignored, a shift closer than before. Still not clearly defined, but undeniably more present. It is no longer just a feeling or a suggestion. It is weight, however faint. The sense that something has adjusted its position within the same space, without announcement. The body reacts before thought can fully form, stillness deepens, breath slows, attention sharpens. There is no panic, only focus. The room feels narrower again, the darkness more concentrated, and then it stops. Completely. No continuation, no follow-up sound, just sudden, complete absence of motion. That absence is what makes it stronger than anything before it. Because now there is confirmation that something was there, even if it cannot be seen or identified. The silence that follows is not empty. It is charged. Minutes pass in this suspended state. The mind refuses to fully relax, but also cannot maintain constant alertness. It exists in a strained balance between the two, held in place by uncertainty rather than fear. Nothing else happens, yet nothing feels resolved. Eventually, exhaustion begins to override attention. The weight of sleep returns, slowly pulling awareness downward again. The sounds of the house reassemble themselves into normality. Breathing becomes just breathing again. The fire is no longer important enough to focus on, and one by one, awareness dissolves. The night continues, but it no longer feels active. Whatever presence, sensation, or disturbance existed moments ago no longer demands attention. It fades not because it is explained, but because the body can no longer sustain awareness of it. Sleep takes over again, deeper this time, more complete. But the memory of waking remains, not as detail, not as image, but as a quiet impression that something passed through the night without leaving evidence behind. As the final stretch of the night settles in, the house reaches a kind of exhausted stillness, the kind that only comes after repeated cycles of waking and returning to sleep. The fire is now barely alive, reduced to faint, scattered embers that glow and fade like a weak heartbeat. Darkness no longer feels like something arriving. It feels like something fully present, occupying every corner without resistance. Inside this deep quiet, sleep becomes heavier, more consuming. The body no longer resists it, even though the mind still carries fragments of awareness from earlier. Thoughts don't form properly anymore. They dissolve before becoming complete. The sense of time weakens further, leaving only the sensation of drifting without direction. And yet, even in this deeper sleep, something changes again. It begins subtly, almost indistinguishably from a dream. A shift in perception rather than sound or movement. The kind of awareness that doesn't fully wake you, but pulls you slightly upward from the depths of rest. The room is still dark, still quiet, but now there is a sense of transition, like the boundary between sleep and waking has become thinner. For a moment, everything feels distant. Then awareness returns more clearly, not fully awake, but no longer fully asleep either. The body remains still, but perception sharpens just enough to recognize the environment again. The outlines of the room are faint, but familiar. The sleeping figures remain unchanged. The fire is almost gone, leaving behind only a suggestion of light. This in-between state is different from before. It doesn't carry the same tension as earlier awakenings. Instead, it feels like observation from a distance, as if you are not fully inside the moment, but watching it from just outside. And in that space, something feels incomplete. Not wrong, not threatening, just unfinished. The silence of the room continues, but it no longer feels uniform. There are layers to it now, moments where it feels heavier, then lighter, then heavier again. The mind tries to adjust to these shifts, but cannot fully anchor them to anything physical. Then comes the sensation again. Not movement this time, not sound. Presence. It is difficult to describe, even in thought. It does not arrive. It does not approach. It does not leave. It simply becomes noticeable, as if something that was always there has finally been acknowledged. The awareness of it is enough to change the way the room feels without anything actually changing. The doorway, once again, holds attention, not visually, but perceptually. It does not appear different, yet it feels like it is not entirely part of the same space as the rest of the room, as if it belongs to a slightly separate version of the same house. The mind tries to reject the feeling, but it does not disappear. Instead, it softens, spreading outward rather than collapsing. It is no longer concentrated in one place. It feels more diffuse, like it exists throughout the room in varying intensity, strongest near the edges of awareness, and weakest when directly examined. Then something extremely subtle happens. A shift in temperature, not dramatic, not immediate, but noticeable enough to register. The air feels slightly different than it did moments before. Cooler in one direction, still in another. The kind of change that doesn't make sense to focus on, yet refuses to be ignored once noticed. The body remains motionless. There is no urge to react, only to observe. Breathing continues slowly, carefully controlled without intention. The boundary between sleep and awareness holds, but only barely. Time again becomes unclear. There is no way to know how long this state lasts. It could be seconds or much longer. The mind is no longer tracking duration in a meaningful way. Instead, it is focused entirely on sensation, on presence, on the quiet instability of the moment. And then once more it fades, not abruptly, not with resolution, just a gradual loss of clarity, as if the awareness that held everything together slowly loosens its grip. The room stops feeling layered and returns to being simple again. The sense of something more diminishes until it is no longer distinguishable from normal darkness. Sleep returns, deeper this time, more stable. No interruptions follow. No further sensations rise from the silence. The house continues through the final hours of night without incident, as if nothing had ever disturbed it at all. The fire remains only as memory in embers, and even those fade completely before dawn arrives. When morning finally breaks, it does so gently, without announcement. Light enters slowly, first as a thin grayness through cracks and openings, then gradually strengthening until shapes become fully visible again. The transformation is immediate in effect, even if gradual in process. The room is exactly as it should be. Nothing is out of place. Nothing has changed. The floor is still covered in straw. The walls stand as they always have. The sleeping bodies begin to stir, returning one by one to wakefulness. And with waking, the night begins to dissolve. What felt layered, uncertain, and heavy during darkness becomes simple and ordinary under daylight. The sensations lose definition. The impressions lose weight. Even the moments that felt significant become difficult to recall clearly. People rise, stretch, and resume movement. The fire is rebuilt, this time with less effort, as if the night's difficulty is already being mentally set aside. Conversations resume, slowly at first, then more naturally. The world outside the house feels stable again, predictable, reliable. And yet, somewhere in the quiet moments of the morning, there is often a pause, a brief hesitation in thought, not a memory of something specific, but a recognition that the night was different, not enough to be called unusual, not enough to be explained, just enough to be remembered in fragments that never fully connect. And so life continues. The day takes over completely, as it always does. Work begins. Sounds return. Movement replaces stillness. The memory of night fades into the background, becoming less important with every passing hour. But when evening comes again, and the light begins to weaken, there is always, quietly, that same return of awareness, that the night is not just absence of day, but something that arrives with its own presence, and sometimes it feels like it remembers you too. As another evening settles over the medieval household, there is a noticeable rhythm to how everything slows down, almost as if the day itself is exhaling. People move with quiet familiarity, completing tasks that must be done before darkness fully arrives. Water is carried in, animals are secured, tools are put away. Nothing is spoken about the night, yet everything is done in preparation for it. The fire becomes the center of attention once again. It is rebuilt with care, as though everyone understands, without needing to say it, that this is what will hold the night back. flames rise steadily, pushing warmth and light into the room, making the interior feel temporarily safe, temporarily complete. Shadows begin to form again, but they remain controlled, shaped by the fire, rather than allowed to spread freely. Dinner is taken in this softened light. The food is simple, familiar, and eaten without ceremony. Conversations are minimal, often interrupted by pauses that feel longer than necessary. There is no visible fear, but there is a kind of quiet attentiveness in everyone's behavior, as if they are aware that night has a way of changing how things feel, even if nothing changes physically. Outside, the sky shifts gradually from blue to deep gray, then to black. The transition feels faster than it should, as though the world is losing light faster than expected. Trees become silhouettes, then vanish completely. The distance beyond the house stops feeling like space and starts feeling like absence, something undefined and unreachable. Inside, the fire holds steady, but it cannot prevent the return of darkness to the corners. The edges of the room begin to soften again, losing detail. People settle into their sleeping places earlier than usual, as if unconsciously agreeing that it is easier to surrender to sleep before night fully asserts itself. Sleep arrives in familiar stages. First, a slow fatting of awareness, then the gradual sinking into rest. The sounds of the room become distant, almost separate from perception. Breathing becomes the only consistent rhythm, shared among everyone, but no longer consciously noticed. The first sleep passes without interruption. Then comes the familiar return. Awareness rises again, not suddenly, but as a gradual re-entry into perception. The room is dark, but recognizable. The fire is weak, but still present. The shapes of sleeping bodies are unchanged. Everything appears as expected, yet perception is slightly sharper than before, as if something in the mind refuses to remain fully unconscious. At first, there is nothing unusual, only silence. But silence, in this state, is never entirely neutral. It carries weight. It feels layered, as if it contains more than just absence of sound. The mind begins to listen more carefully, even without intention. Not searching for anything specific, just remaining open. And then, as before, something shifts. Not a sound that can be clearly identified. Not movement that can be fully observed. Instead, a change in the quality of stillness itself. A subtle interruption in what should feel continuous. It is small enough to be ignored, but persistent enough that it cannot be fully dismissed. Attention focuses. The doorway, once again, becomes a point of unconscious fixation. It does not look different, but it feels different. The darkness there does not match the rest of the room in perception, even though visually it is the same. This mismatch between sight and sensation creates a quiet tension that is difficult to resolve. The body remains still. There is no reaction beyond awareness. No movement, no sound, only observation. The room continues to exist as it always has, yet perception begins to divide it into areas of certainty and uncertainty without clear reason. Then, briefly, something almost happens. A suggestion of movement, not seen directly, not heard clearly, but perceived at the edge of awareness. The kind of impression that disappears when attention is directed toward it. The mind tries to hold on to it, but it dissolves immediately, leaving behind only uncertainty. Silence returns, heavier than before, not because anything new has occurred, but because expectation has changed. Now, even stillness feels like it contains potential. The room is no longer simply quiet. It feels like it is waiting, though for what is not known. Minutes pass in this suspended condition. The body remains motionless, but awareness does not fully relax. It exists in a fragile balance between alertness and sleep, unable to commit to either. The fire weakens further, reducing the room to near darkness, where only outlines remain, and yet nothing fully reveals itself. Eventually, the intensity of attention begins to fade, not because the feeling disappears, but because the mind cannot maintain it indefinitely. Fatigue returns, slowly overriding heightened awareness. The edges of perception soften. Sleep begins to pull again, this time more gently. Less resistance, less questioning. The room loses its structure once more, returning to a more abstract state of darkness and sound. Breathing becomes distant again. Thought becomes fragmented. The second sleep takes hold, and with it, the room returns to deeper stillness. No further interruptions occur. No further sensations rise sharply enough to break through rest. The night continues in quiet continuity, as if everything that felt uncertain earlier has now settled into nothing. Time loses meaning again, until eventually the first hint of morning begins to appear. It arrives slowly, almost imperceptibly. A faint lightening of the darkness, a softening of shadows, the gradual return of definition to the world. Shapes that were once uncertain become clearer, more stable. The fire is no longer a flame, only remnants of heat and ash. The room feels different not because it has changed, but because perception has changed. What felt layered and uncertain during the night now feels simple again. One by one, people begin to wake. Movements return. Small sounds fill the space. The transition from night to day is quiet, routine, familiar. Nothing about the room suggests anything unusual occurred. Everything is as it was before. And yet, in the quiet moments between waking and full awareness, there is often a pause, a brief hesitation in thought, not a memory of something specific, but a recognition that the night was not entirely ordinary in feeling, even if nothing can be clearly defined. And as the day fully arrives, that feeling begins to fade once again, replaced by the certainty of daylight. But somewhere beneath it, the night remains remembered only in fragments, waiting quietly for its return. As the day fully takes hold again, the medieval household returns to its familiar rhythm. But there is a subtle difference in how people carry themselves compared to earlier days. It is not something spoken aloud, nor something clearly acknowledged, yet it exists in small pauses and brief hesitations. The morning light reveals everything plainly, but it cannot erase the faint impression left behind by the night. Work begins as usual. Firewood is gathered, animals are tended, tools are used with practiced ease. Life continues in its steady, unbroken cycle. But every now and then, someone pauses for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, as if recalling something just out of reach. These moments are brief, almost invisible, and quickly replaced by routine activity. The house itself looks completely unchanged in daylight. The walls stand firm, the floor is ordinary, and the space feels simple and predictable again. Whatever intensity existed during the night seems impossible to attach to this same environment. And yet, the memory of feeling remains, even if the details do not. Conversation during the morning is practical and direct. There is talk of tasks, weather, food, and daily needs. Nothing unusual is mentioned. But beneath these ordinary exchanges, there is a quiet awareness shared between people who experienced the same night, even if they do not confirm it to one another. As the sun rises higher, the warmth of the day begins to spread through the structure of the house. Shadows retreat completely, replaced by clarity and openness. The corners that once felt uncertain now appear ordinary and harmless. The doorway that seemed different in darkness is now just wood and space, nothing more. Still, memory does not function like daylight. It does not rely on visibility or proof. Instead, it lingers in impressions. A feeling of interruption. A sense that something existed just beyond understanding, even if it left no trace. These impressions are what remain, even when explanation is impossible. As the day progresses, the mind begins to rationalize. It assigns familiar meanings to unfamiliar sensations. A sound in the night becomes wood settling. A feeling becomes fatigue. A moment of awareness becomes imagination influenced by darkness. These explanations help restore balance to perception, allowing normal life to continue. Yet, even with these explanations, something subtle resists complete resolution, because not all experiences are easily translated into certainty. The household continues its daily rhythm into the afternoon. Sunlight fills the space more fully now, making everything feel grounded and stable. There is movement, activity, and sound. Life feels present and continuous. And for a while, the night seems distant, almost irrelevant. But as evening approaches once again, the atmosphere begins to shift. It starts gradually, almost imperceptibly. Tasks are completed a bit earlier. Movements become slightly more deliberate. Conversations shorten without intention. There is no clear reason for this change, but it happens consistently, as if the body itself remembers what the mind tries not to focus on. The fire is prepared earlier than necessary, not out of fear, but out of habit shaped by experience that cannot be easily described. Flames are encouraged to grow strong before darkness returns, as if strength in light might delay whatever comes with night. Outside, the sky begins its familiar transformation. Colors soften, then deepen. The boundary between day and night once again becomes visible, as though the world is preparing to shift into another state of existence. The land grows quieter, not because sound disappears, but because attention withdraws from it. Inside, people begin to settle earlier than before. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but with quiet coordination that requires no discussion. Everyone seems to understand the same unspoken timing. The transition into night is not resisted, but carefully managed. As darkness returns, the fire becomes central again. Its light is steadier now, built with intention. It pushes back against the growing shadows more effectively than before. The room feels contained within its glow, held together by warmth and light. Yet even this containment feels temporary, as though it depends entirely on the fire's persistence. Dinner is taken quietly as before. The food is simple, the movements familiar. But there is a slight difference in awareness. People are more present in their surroundings, more aware of sounds, more conscious of silence. Nothing is said about it, but the change is noticeable in how attention is distributed. When the meal ends, the shift toward rest begins earlier than expected. Bodies move toward sleeping places with less delay. The fire remains strong, but its presence now feels like preparation rather than comfort alone. Darkness outside is complete, and the boundary between inside and outside feels more defined. Sleep begins once again in its familiar sequence. First, gradual relaxation, then fading awareness, then the slow descent into unconsciousness. The room becomes quieter, not abruptly, but steadily, until only breathing remains as the dominant presence within the space. The first sleep passes without interruption, but the memory of previous nights is no longer entirely absent. Even in sleep, there is a faint trace of awareness that seems to remain closer to the surface than before. Not active, not conscious, but present in a way that slightly alters the depth of rest. The mind does not fully let go as easily as it once did. Then once again, the shift occurs. Awareness returns slowly. The room is dark, unchanged, familiar. The fire is reduced to a faint glow. The shapes of sleeping bodies remain as expected. Everything appears normal. Yet perception is immediately more sensitive than before, as if the boundary between sleep and wakefulness has become thinner. Silence is present, but it feels layered, not empty, not neutral, but structured in a way that suggests depth beyond simple absence of sound. The mind does not search for anything, yet it remains attentive without intention. And then, as before, a change occurs, not clearly defined, not easily identified, but noticeable in the way stillness behaves. Something feels slightly different, as if the room has shifted into a version of itself that is almost identical, but not entirely the same. Attention naturally moves toward familiar points, the doorway, the corners, the edges of perception. Nothing appears different. Nothing confirms the feeling. And yet, the feeling itself does not disappear. It persists without evidence. Minutes pass in this condition. The body remains still. The mind remains alert. And the space between them becomes the entire experience. No clear event occurs, yet awareness remains fully engaged with the possibility that something could. Eventually, as before, the intensity begins to fade, not because understanding arrives, but because exhaustion and sleep begin to reclaim attention. The edges of perception soften. The sense of structure in the room weakens. Awareness becomes less focused, more diffuse. Sleep returns once again, deeper now, more complete, less interrupted. The night continues without further disruption, and by the time morning arrives, everything is once again ordinary in appearance, but not entirely in memory, because even when nothing can be clearly remembered, the feeling of the night remains. Quiet, unspoken, as another morning unfolds in the medieval household, the world outside feels once again solid and predictable, as if the uncertainty of the night has been neatly folded away into the past. Light enters the space fully, revealing every corner in plain detail. What once felt layered or uncertain in darkness now appears simple, unchanged, and entirely ordinary. The contrast between night and day is so complete that it almost feels like two separate versions of the same place. Daily activity resumes with steady familiarity. Water is fetched, food is prepared, tools are used, and animals are tended to with practiced rhythm. Life continues without interruption, as it always has. Yet, beneath the surface of these ordinary movements, there is a quiet consistency in the way people occasionally pause, as if their thoughts briefly drift somewhere they cannot fully describe. No one speaks about the night directly. There is no discussion of feelings or impressions. Instead, everything remains within the boundaries of practicality. Work, weather, food, time, these are the subjects that fill the air. Anything beyond that remains unspoken, not because it is forbidden, but because it is difficult to define in words that would make sense in daylight. The house itself feels different under the sun, even though nothing has changed physically. Walls are just walls again. Floors are just floors. The doorway that seemed uncertain in darkness is now simply an entry point, no different from any other part of the structure. Clarity replaces ambiguity, and with it comes a sense of stability that feels complete. As the morning moves toward midday, the memory of the night begins to lose sharpness. It does not disappear, but it becomes less defined, more fragmented. The mind naturally fills gaps with explanations that make sense within the structure of daily life. Sounds become ordinary. Sensations become routine. The unknown is gradually reshaped into something familiar. This process is not conscious. It happens slowly, without effort, as part of the way people continue forward. Life demands attention in the present, and the present is always filled with tangible tasks that leave little space for reflection. In this way, the night is gently pushed into the background of awareness. By midday, the household feels fully active again. Sunlight is strong, movement is steady, and sound fills the space in a consistent rhythm. There is no hesitation in actions, no uncertainty in perception. Everything appears stable, both inside and outside the home. Yet even in this clarity, there are moments that pass quietly. A brief pause in movement, a short silence between tasks, a glance toward a corner of the room that lasts just a little longer than necessary. These moments are subtle, almost unnoticeable, but they exist. They do not disrupt the flow of the day, but they hint at something that remains just beneath awareness. As afternoon arrives, the light begins to soften slightly. The angle of the sun changes, casting longer shadows across the ground. The world starts its slow transition toward evening, though it is still far from darkness. This shift is gradual, but it is always felt in some way, even if not consciously acknowledged. Work begins to slow down slightly, not because of fatigue, but because the structure of the day naturally moves toward completion. Tasks are finished, tools are put away, and attention gradually shifts from outward activity toward preparation for the evening. Inside the house, firewood is gathered again. This time, the action feels almost automatic, as though it is part of a cycle that requires no thought. Wood is stacked carefully, not out of urgency, but out of routine. The expectation of night is already present, even though it has not yet arrived. As evening draws closer, the atmosphere begins to change in subtle ways. There is no dramatic shift, no sudden awareness. Instead, it is a gradual adjustment in behavior and attention. Movements become slightly slower, conversations shorter, and pauses more frequent. The transition from day to night is not abrupt. It is absorbed slowly into the rhythm of life. When the sun finally lowers toward the horizon, the change becomes more visible. Light softens, shadows lengthen, and the environment begins to lose its sharp definition. The world outside the house becomes less distinct, while the interior begins to take on greater importance. The fire is prepared again, this time with quiet efficiency. Flames rise steadily, reclaiming the center of the space. Warmth spreads through the room, creating a sense of enclosure that feels both comforting and familiar. Darkness gathers at the edges, but it is held back, for now, by the presence of light. Dinner follows, simple and unremarkable. Food is eaten without distraction, and conversation remains minimal. There is no need to discuss what is already understood. The structure of the evening is familiar, repeated countless times before, and yet always experienced slightly differently. As night approaches fully, people begin to settle into their places earlier than necessary, not out of urgency, but out of alignment with a rhythm that has become instinctive. The fire continues to burn steadily, offering stability against the growing darkness outside. Sleep begins its gradual approach. First, a slowing of thought, then a softening of awareness, then the gentle transition into rest. The room becomes quieter, more contained, as the sounds of daily life fade into background stillness. Breathing becomes the dominant rhythm once again, shared but unacknowledged. The first sleep arrives without resistance. It feels natural, uninterrupted, and complete. But as before, it does not remain uninterrupted. Awareness returns again, not sharply, but gradually, as though rising from a deeper layer of rest. The room is dark, unchanged, and familiar. The fire is reduced to faint embers. The shapes within the space remain as expected. Nothing appears different at first glance, and yet perception is already more sensitive than before. Silence is present, but it feels structured in a way that is difficult to ignore. It is not simply absence of sound, it feels layered, as though it contains more than it reveals. The mind does not actively search, but it remains attentive without intention. Then once again, a shift occurs, subtle, indefinable, but present, not a sound that can be clearly identified, not a movement that can be fully observed. Instead, a change in the quality of stillness itself, something that alters the way the space is perceived without altering its visible form. Attention naturally moves toward familiar areas, the doorway, the corners, the edges of perception. Everything appears normal. Nothing confirms the sensation. And yet, the sensation does not disappear. It continues to exist without evidence. Time passes in this condition without clear structure. Awareness remains active but unstable. The body remains still, and the mind remains alert, suspended between recognition and uncertainty. The fire weakens further, reducing visibility to near darkness. Eventually, as before, the intensity begins to fade, not through resolution, but through exhaustion. The mind can no longer maintain focus at this level. The edges of perception soften. The sense of structure within the room dissolves gradually. Awareness becomes less defined, more diffuse. Sleep returns once again, deeper this time, more complete, and the night continues without interruption, as it always does, until morning arrives, and everything once again becomes ordinary in appearance, but never entirely in feeling. As dawn finally breaks once more over the medieval household, the first light does not arrive dramatically, but instead seeps gently through the small openings of the structure, slowly revealing the world that had been hidden in darkness. The transition is almost unnoticeable at first, as if the night is reluctant to fully release its hold. But gradually shapes become clearer, and the room begins to feel more grounded in reality again. The sleeping figures begin to stir, one after another, in a slow and natural rhythm. There is no urgency in their waking, only the gradual return of awareness. The fire, now reduced to faint ash and lingering heat, is carefully revived. Small sparks catch again, and a weak flame begins to grow, bringing warmth and definition back into the space. Morning tasks begin without discussion. Everything follows a familiar sequence that requires no planning or debate. Water is fetched, bread is prepared, and tools are gathered for the day ahead. Life continues in its steady cycle, unchanged in structure, as if the night had been nothing more than a pause in motion. Yet within this routine, something subtle persists, not as a thought, not as a memory in clear form, but as a sensation that briefly appears and disappears between actions. A quiet impression that the night contained something slightly more than ordinary rest. It is not strong enough to interrupt daily life, but it is present enough to be noticed in passing moments of stillness. As the household becomes fully active again, the environment feels increasingly normal. Sunlight strengthens, shadows retreat, and the space becomes fully defined once more. Walls, objects, and corners regain their simple, stable identities. There is no uncertainty in daylight, only clarity. And yet, clarity does not erase experience. It only reshapes how it is remembered. As people move through their tasks, there are moments when attention briefly drifts. A pause while carrying water, a moment of stillness while working with tools, a short silence between spoken words. These are not disruptions, but natural pauses in the rhythm of the day. Still, they carry a faint echo of something unspoken. By mid-morning, the household is fully engaged in work. The outside world is active as well, with distant sounds of labor and movement blending into a continuous background of life. Everything feels stable, predictable, and grounded in the reality of the present moment. The house itself no longer feels uncertain or layered. It is simply a place of shelter and activity. The doorway is just an opening. The walls are just structure. The space holds no mystery in daylight, only function. As the day continues, the memory of night becomes less distinct. It does not vanish completely, but it loses its shape. The mind naturally organizes experience into familiar categories, replacing unclear sensations with simple explanations. What felt unusual in darkness becomes ordinary in reflection. This process happens quietly, without effort. It is part of how daily life maintains its balance. Without it, the weight of every night would remain too present during the day. Instead, experience experience is softened, redistributed, and made manageable. By afternoon, the household is fully immersed in routine again. The sense of the night has receded further into the background. Attention is focused on present tasks, present needs, and present conditions. The world feels stable, continuous, and entirely ordinary, and yet time does not remain still. As the sun begins its gradual descent again, there is a familiar shift that takes place. Not sudden, not dramatic, but steady. The quality of light changes first, becoming warmer, softer. Then shadows begin to lengthen, stretching slowly across the ground and into the interior of the home. With this change comes a subtle shift in behavior. Tasks are completed a little earlier. Movements become slightly more deliberate. Conversations shorten without intention. It is not fear nor expectation, but a kind of alignment with a rhythm that has been repeated countless times before. Inside the house, preparations begin again for the coming night. Firewood is gathered and arranged. The hearth is checked. Everything is done in a quiet, practiced manner that requires no instruction. The cycle continues as it always has. When evening arrives fully, the transformation becomes more noticeable. Light outside fades steadily, and the boundary between day and night becomes clear once more. The world outside the house loses definition, while the interior becomes increasingly important as the center of activity. The fire is lit and strengthened, becoming once again the primary source of light and warmth. Flames rise and settle, casting familiar shadows across the walls. The space feels enclosed, protected, and contained within its glow. Dinner is taken quietly, without disruption or change from previous nights. Food is simple, shared, and consumed without ceremony. Conversation is minimal, not due to discomfort, but due to familiarity. There is no need for explanation when the routine is already understood. As night fully returns, the household settles into rest. Sleeping places are prepared, and bodies gradually lower into stillness. The fire remains active but controlled, maintaining its steady presence as darkness gathers outside. Sleep arrives in its usual stages. First, relaxation, then fading awareness, then unconsciousness. The room becomes quieter, more uniform, and less defined as sleep deepens. Breathing becomes the only consistent rhythm within the space. Time loses structure again, as it always does during rest. The first sleep passes without interruption, but as before, awareness eventually returns, not suddenly, but gradually, as though rising from beneath layers of rest. The room is dark, unchanged, and familiar. The fire is reduced to faint embers. The sleeping figures remain still. Everything appears normal at first perception, yet perception is once again heightened. Silence is present, but it feels layered, not empty, but structured in a way that suggests depth beyond simple absence. The mind does not actively search for meaning, but it remains attentive, aware, without intention. Then once again, something shifts, not clearly defined, not directly observable, but present in the way stillness behaves. A subtle change in the quality of the environment that cannot be fully explained or dismissed. Attention naturally moves toward familiar points, the doorway, the corners, the edges of the room. Nothing appears different. Nothing confirms the sensation. And yet, the sensation does not disappear. It persists without evidence. Time becomes unclear again. There is no sense of progression, only continuation. Awareness remains suspended between observation and uncertainty, unable to fully resolve either direction. The fire weakens further, reducing visibility to near darkness. Shapes become less distinct. The room feels both familiar and slightly distant, as if viewed through a thin layer of separation. Eventually, the intensity of awareness begins to fade, not because understanding arrives, but because the mind can no longer sustain focus at this level. The edges of perception soften. The sense of structure dissolves gradually. Everything becomes less defined. Sleep returns once more, deeper, heavier, more complete, and the night continues, uninterrupted, until morning eventually arrives again. When it does, everything once again becomes ordinary in appearance. The house is unchanged. The world is stable. Life resumes its rhythm. But beneath it all, just as before, there remains a quiet trace of something unspoken, something that cannot be fully captured in daylight, yet never completely disappears from memory. As yet another morning spreads across the medieval landscape, the household wakes into a world that feels completely restored to order. The light is steady, the air is clear, and everything appears firmly rooted in the certainty of daylight. It is the kind of morning that makes the events of the night feel distant, almost unreal, as if they belonged to a different version of life entirely. The first movements of the day begin as usual. Bodies rise from their resting places, fire is revived, and the familiar sounds of daily activity return. There is no hesitation in action, no visible disruption in routine. Everything resumes its place in the structure of the day with practiced ease, as though nothing unusual had ever occurred. Yet, within this return to normality, something subtle continues to exist. It is not a memory that can be clearly spoken. It is not an image that can be fully recalled. Instead, it exists as a faint impression that briefly surfaces during quiet moments. A sense that the night carried something just beyond ordinary understanding, even if no clear detail can be attached to it. As the morning progresses, the household becomes fully active once again. Work is resumed, tools are used, and tasks are completed with steady rhythm. The outside world mirrors this activity, with sounds of labor and movement blending into the background of daily life. Everything feels consistent, reliable, and unchanged. The house itself feels entirely ordinary under daylight. Walls are just walls. Doors are just openings. Corners are simply corners. Whatever sense of uncertainty or depth existed during the night no longer seems present. The environment is stable, clear, and fully defined. Still, human perception does not always align perfectly with physical reality. There are moments during the morning when attention briefly drifts. A pause between tasks, a short silence in conversation, a glance that lasts slightly longer than necessary toward a familiar space. These moments are small, almost invisible, but they carry a faint residue of something unspoken. By midday, the household is fully engaged in its rhythm of work. The sun is strong, the environment is bright, and there is no sign of anything unusual in the world. The passage of time feels smooth and continuous, without interruption or irregularity. At this point, the memory of the night has mostly dissolved into general familiarity. It no longer exists as a clear sequence of events, but rather as scattered impressions that do not form a complete picture. This is how the mind naturally organizes experience, reducing complexity into simplicity, so that daily life can continue without burden. As the afternoon arrives, the light begins to soften slightly. Shadows stretch further across the ground, and the world starts its gradual transition toward evening once again. This shift is subtle but familiar, marking the slow return of a cycle that has repeated countless times. With this change comes a quiet adjustment in behavior. Tasks begin to conclude earlier. Movements become slightly more deliberate. Conversation shortens without intention. There is no conscious reason for this shift, but it happens consistently, as if the body and mind both recognize the approaching change in environment. Inside the house, preparation for evening begins once again. Firewood is gathered and arranged. The hearth is checked. Everything is done with calm repetition, without urgency or discussion. The cycle continues as it always has, shaped by habit and experience rather than instruction. As evening deepens, the transformation becomes more noticeable. The quality of light changes, becoming warmer and less direct. Shadows lengthen and spread, gradually reclaiming space within and around the house. The boundary between day and night becomes visible once more. Inside, the fire is lit and strengthened again. Flames rise steadily, bringing warmth and structure back into the room. The glow restores definition to objects and surfaces, holding back the growing darkness at the edges. For a time, the interior feels complete, as though it exists within its own contained world. Dinner is taken quietly, with familiar simplicity. Food is shared, eaten, and finished without ceremony. Conversation remains minimal, not out of tension, but out of familiarity. The structure of the evening is known so well that it no longer requires discussion. As night fully arrives, the household begins its transition into rest. Sleeping areas are prepared, and bodies gradually settle into stillness. The fire remains active, but controlled, offering a steady presence against the surrounding darkness. Sleep begins its usual progression. First, relaxation of the body, then fading of thought, then gradual loss of awareness. The room becomes quieter and more unified as sleep deepens. Sound reduces to breathing, and time loses structure once again. The night resumes its familiar rhythm of stillness. The first sleep passes without interruption, but as always, it does not remain uninterrupted. Awareness returns slowly, without force or alarm. The room is dark, unchanged, and familiar. The fire is reduced to faint embers. The sleeping figures remain in place. Everything appears normal in immediate perception, yet perception is again subtly heightened. Silence is present, but it feels complex. Not empty, but layered in a way that suggests depth beyond simple absence. The mind does not actively search, but it remains attentive in a passive, continuous way. Then once again, something shifts. It is not a sound that can be clearly identified, not movement that can be fully observed. It is instead a change in the quality of stillness itself, a subtle alteration in how the environment is perceived without any visible cause. Attention naturally moves toward familiar points, the doorway, the corners, the darker regions of the room. Nothing appears different. Nothing confirms the sensation. And yet, the sensation remains present. It continues without evidence. Time becomes unclear again. There is no sense of progression, only continuity. Awareness exists in a suspended state between observation and uncertainty, unable to resolve either direction fully. The fire weakens further, reducing visibility to near darkness. Shapes become indistinct. The room feels both familiar and slightly removed, as if viewed through a thin layer of separation that cannot be crossed. Eventually, as before, the intensity of awareness begins to fade, not through explanation or resolution, but through exhaustion. The mind can no longer maintain focus at this level. The edges of perception soften. Structure dissolves gradually. Everything becomes less defined. Sleep returns once again, deeper, heavier, more complete, and the night continues uninterrupted until morning eventually arrives. When it does, everything once again becomes ordinary in appearance. The house remains unchanged. The world remains stable. Life resumes its familiar rhythm. But beneath the surface of this stability, there is always a faint trace left behind. As another evening settles over the medieval world, the familiar cycle begins again. But this time, there is a slight difference that no one openly acknowledges. It is not a change in the house, nor in the surroundings, but in the way people people move through the final hours of daylight. Actions are more deliberate, pauses slightly longer, and attention more divided between tasks and the approaching night. The fire is prepared earlier than before, almost instinctively. Wood is gathered, arranged, and lit with quiet precision. Flames rise and stabilize, creating a strong center of light within the room. The glow feels more important than usual, as if its presence alone defines the safety of the space. Shadows still form at the edges, but they remain weaker for now, held back by the steady brightness. Dinner takes place under this controlled light. Food is simple, shared, and eaten without interruption. Conversation is brief, often ending before it fully develops. There is no visible concern, but there is a subtle awareness that seems to exist beneath every interaction. It is not fear, but recognition of pattern, something remembered rather than imagined. Outside, the sky transitions quickly as evening deepens. Colors fade from blue to gray, then to a dense, uniform darkness. The world beyond the house loses definition entirely, becoming something that cannot be easily measured or mentally mapped. Distance stops feeling like space and begins to feel like absence. Inside, the fire continues to dominate the environment. Its light defines the room, giving structure to objects and people. Without it, everything would quickly dissolve into indistinct shadow. The importance of this simple element becomes more noticeable the longer one observes it. As night fully arrives, the household begins its transition into rest earlier than expected. Sleeping areas are prepared without delay. Movements are efficient, familiar, and quiet. No one speaks unnecessarily. Everything follows a rhythm that feels established over time rather than consciously decided. Sleep begins its gradual descent. First, the slowing of physical movement, then the softening of awareness, then the steady withdrawal into unconsciousness. The room becomes quieter with each passing moment, until only breathing remains as the primary sound. The fire dims slightly, but continues to burn, maintaining a fragile balance between light and darkness. The first sleep passes without interruption, but as has become familiar, it does not remain uninterrupted. Awareness returns again, slowly and without force. The transition is not sudden, but gradual, as though rising through layers of depth. The room is dark, stable, and unchanged. The fire is reduced to faint embers. The figures of sleeping people remain still and undisturbed. At first, everything appears ordinary, but perception is once again heightened in a way that is difficult to ignore. Silence feels structured rather than empty. It is not simply absence of sound, but a condition that seems to carry depth. The mind does not actively search for meaning, but it remains quietly attentive. Then once again, something shifts. It is not a sound that can be clearly identified, not a movement that can be fully seen. It is instead a change in the quality of the environment itself. Something in the way stillness exists feels slightly altered, though nothing visible confirms it. Attention naturally moves toward familiar areas: the doorway, the darker corners of the room, the edges where light fades completely. Nothing appears unusual. Nothing confirms the sensation. And yet, the sensation persists without needing confirmation. Time becomes unstable again. There is no clear sense of progression, only continuity. Awareness exists in a suspended state between observation and uncertainty, unable to fully resolve either direction. The fire weakens further, reducing visibility to near complete darkness. Shapes lose clarity. Boundaries between objects blur. The room feels both familiar and slightly distant, as though it is being observed from a position just outside full comprehension. Then a subtle change occurs. Not sudden, not dramatic, but noticeable. The quality of silence shifts again, not into sound, but into something denser. It feels as though the space itself has become more aware of its own stillness. This impression is difficult to define, yet impossible to fully ignore once perceived. The body remains motionless. There is no reaction beyond awareness. The mind does not interpret this moment as danger or safety. It simply observes, suspended in uncertainty. Minutes pass in this condition. There is no external confirmation of anything happening, yet perception remains fully engaged. The environment does not change visibly, but it feels different in experience. Eventually, the intensity begins to fade, not through resolution, but through fatigue. The mind can no longer maintain the same level of focus. The edges of perception soften. Structure dissolves gradually. Everything becomes less defined, less distinct, less immediate. Sleep returns once more, deeper, heavier, more complete, and the night continues without interruption, until eventually the first signs of morning begin to appear again. A faint light enters the space, slowly transforming darkness into shape and structure. The transition is gradual but undeniable. Shadows lose depth. Objects regain definition. The fire is reduced to ash and faint warmth. One by one, people begin to wake. Movement returns. Sound returns. The structure of daily life reassembles itself with familiar ease. Everything appears unchanged, stable, and ordinary. And yet, as always, there is a quiet moment, almost imperceptible, where awareness briefly pauses before fully engaging with the day. Not a memory, not a thought, just a feeling that the night, once again, was not entirely empty, and that somewhere, beneath the certainty of daylight, something remains unresolved, waiting quietly for the next return of darkness. As yet another morning unfolds across the medieval settlement, the household wakes into a world that feels fully restored to certainty. Light spreads steadily through the space, revealing everything in its simplest form. There is no ambiguity, no uncertainty, only structure, clarity, and the familiar rhythm of daily life, resuming exactly as expected. The first movements of the day begin without hesitation. People rise, stretch, and return to their responsibilities with practiced ease. The fire is rekindled, water is carried, and tasks are assigned and completed in quiet coordination. Nothing appears out of place, and nothing suggests that the night contained anything unusual in a visible or tangible sense. Yet beneath this surface of normality, something subtle continues to exist. It is not a memory in the traditional sense. It is not a clear image or event. Instead, it exists as a faint impression that occasionally surfaces in moments of stillness. A feeling that the night carried something just beyond the boundaries of ordinary understanding, even if no direct evidence remains. As the morning progresses, the household becomes fully active. Work resumes with steady rhythm. Tools are used, materials are handled, and communication remains functional and practical. The outside world mirrors this activity, forming a continuous flow of movement and sound that reinforces the stability of the present moment. The house itself, under daylight, appears entirely unremarkable. Every corner is visible, every object is defined, and every space feels grounded in physical certainty. Whatever sense of depth or uncertainty existed during the night no longer seems present. The environment is simply what it is, solid, familiar, and stable. Still, human perception does not operate purely on visible reality. There are brief pauses during the day when attention drifts unexpectedly. A moment of stillness while performing a task. A short silence in conversation. A glance that lingers slightly longer than necessary toward a familiar space. These moments are small and easily overlooked, yet they carry a faint residue of something unspoken. By midday, the household is fully immersed in routine. The sun is strong, the environment is bright, and everything feels consistent and predictable. The passage of time is smooth, uninterrupted, and without irregularity. Life continues in its established rhythm without deviation. At this stage, the memory of the night has largely dissolved into abstraction. It no longer exists as a structured sequence of events, but rather as scattered impressions that do not fully connect. The mind naturally organizes experience in a way that reduces complexity, replacing uncertainty with familiarity. As the afternoon arrives, the quality of light begins to change. It softens slightly, casting longer shadows across the ground. The transition toward evening begins again, subtle but unavoidable. This shift is not abrupt, but it is always noticed in some form, even if not consciously acknowledged. With this transition comes a quiet adjustment in behavior. Tasks begin to conclude earlier. Movements become more deliberate. Silence between actions becomes slightly longer. These changes are not driven by fear or expectation, but by repetition, by a cycle that has been experienced many times before and has gradually shaped instinctive behavior. Inside the house, preparation for the evening begins once more. Firewood is gathered and arranged. The hearth is checked. Everything is done with calm familiarity, without urgency or discussion. The pattern is consistent, shaped by habit and continuity rather than instruction. As evening deepens, the transformation becomes more noticeable. Light changes in quality, becoming warmer and less direct. Shadows stretch and gradually reclaim space within the environment. The boundary between day and night becomes clearly visible again. Inside, the fire is lit and strengthened. Flames rise steadily, restoring definition to the interior space. Warmth spreads throughout the room, creating a contained environment that feels temporarily secure. Darkness gathers at the edges, but it is held back by the presence of light. Dinner is taken quietly, as usual. Food is simple, shared, and consumed without ceremony. Conversation is minimal, not due to tension, but due to familiarity. The structure of the evening requires no explanation because it has been repeated countless times before. As night fully arrives, the household begins its transition into rest. Sleeping areas are prepared, and bodies gradually settle into stillness. The fire remains active, but controlled, maintaining a steady presence against the growing darkness outside. Sleep begins its familiar progression. First, relaxation of the body, then fading of thought, then gradual loss of awareness. The room becomes quieter, more unified, and less defined as sleep deepens. Sound reduces to breathing. Time loses structure. The night resumes its familiar state of stillness. The first sleep passes without interruption, but as always, it does not remain uninterrupted. Awareness returns again, slowly and without force. The transition is gradual, as though rising from a deeper layer of rest. The room is dark, unchanged, and familiar. The fire is reduced to faint embers. The sleeping figures remain still. At first, everything appears normal, yet perception is once again heightened in a subtle but persistent way. Silence feels layered rather than empty. It carries a sense of depth that is difficult to define. The mind does not actively search, but it remains quietly attentive. Then once again, something shifts. It is not a sound. It is not a visible movement. It is instead a change in the quality of stillness itself. Something about the environment feels slightly altered, though nothing concrete confirms this impression. Attention naturally moves toward familiar points, the doorway, the corners, the darker areas of the room. Nothing appears different. Nothing confirms the sensation. And yet, the sensation does not disappear. It continues without evidence. Time becomes unstable again. There is no clear sense of progression, only continuation. Awareness exists in a suspended condition between observation and uncertainty, unable to resolve either direction fully. The fire weakens further, reducing visibility to near darkness. Shapes lose clarity, boundaries blur. The room feels both familiar and slightly removed, as though viewed through a thin separation that cannot be crossed. Eventually, the intensity of awareness begins to fade, not through explanation, but through exhaustion. The mind can no longer sustain focus at this level. The edges of perception soften. Structure dissolves gradually. Everything becomes less defined. Sleep returns once again, deeper, heavier, more complete, and the night continues without interruption until morning arrives. When it does, everything once again becomes ordinary in appearance. The house remains unchanged. The world remains stable. Life resumes its rhythm. But beneath this stability, there remains something faint and unspoken, an impression that never fully disappears, even if it cannot be clearly defined. And so the cycle continues, day after day, night after night, each one familiar, each one slightly different in feeling, and each one carrying, quietly, the same unanswered sense of something just beyond understanding. As yet another evening begins to settle over the medieval world, the transition feels almost ritualistic now, as if the entire household moves in sync with an invisible pattern shaped by countless previous nights. There is no discussion, no hesitation, only a quiet understanding that daylight is ending, and the familiar cycle is about to begin once again. The atmosphere shifts gradually, not dramatically, but with a certainty that everyone has learned to recognize. The fire is prepared earlier than before, almost automatically. Wood is gathered and arranged with care, not because anyone is uncertain, but because experience has taught them the importance of maintaining warmth and light before darkness fully arrives. Flames rise steadily, establishing the center of the room once again. The glow feels steady, controlled, and essential, as though it defines the boundary between safety and uncertainty. Dinner is taken in this controlled light, with little variation from previous evenings. Food is simple and shared without ceremony. Conversations are brief, often fading into silence before they fully develop. There is no visible tension, yet there is a consistent awareness that seems to linger beneath every interaction, subtle and unspoken, like something remembered without being directly acknowledged. Outside, the sky undergoes its familiar transformation. The last traces of daylight fade into deepening gray, then into complete darkness. The world beyond the house gradually loses its shape, becoming undefined and distant. What once felt like space now feels like absence, as if everything beyond the walls has temporarily ceased to exist in any meaningful way. Inside, the fire takes on greater importance as night approaches. Its light defines the interior space, giving form to objects and structure to the room itself. Without it, everything would quickly dissolve into indistinct shadow. The reliance on this single source of light becomes more noticeable as darkness grows stronger outside. As night fully arrives, the household begins its transition into rest earlier than usual. Sleeping places are prepared without delay, and movements become quieter and more efficient. There is no conversation about it, but the timing feels naturally aligned, as if everyone understands the importance of settling before the night deepens completely. Sleep begins its familiar descent. First, the slowing of movement, then the softening of awareness, then the gradual fading into unconsciousness. The room becomes quieter with each passing moment, until only breathing remains as the dominant presence. The fire continues to burn, but more faintly now, maintaining a fragile balance between light and surrounding darkness. The first sleep passes without interruption, but as always, it does not remain uninterrupted. Awareness returns again, not suddenly, but gradually, as though rising from a deeper layer of rest. The room is dark, unchanged, and familiar. The fire is reduced to faint embers. The sleeping figures remain in their places, undisturbed. At first, everything appears normal, yet perception is once again subtly heightened. Silence feels structured, almost layered, as if it contains more than simple absence of sound. The mind does not actively search for meaning, but it remains quietly attentive, aware, without intention. Then once again, something shifts, not clearly defined, not easily identified, but present in the way stillness behaves. There is a subtle change in the quality of the environment that cannot be fully explained, though it is immediately felt once noticed. Attention naturally moves toward familiar points, the doorway, the corners, the darker areas of the room. Nothing appears different. Nothing confirms the sensation. And yet, the sensation persists without needing confirmation. It exists without evidence. Time once again becomes unstable. There is no clear progression, only continuation. Awareness remains suspended between observation and uncertainty, unable to fully resolve either state. The fire weakens further, reducing visibility to near complete darkness. Shapes lose clarity. Boundaries dissolve. The room feels both familiar and slightly distant, as though it is being experienced through a thin separation that cannot be crossed. Then a subtle change occurs. It is not sudden. It is not dramatic, but it is noticeable in the way silence feels slightly heavier than before. Not louder, not different in sound, but denser in presence, as if the absence of noise itself has gained weight. The body remains motionless. There is no reaction beyond awareness. The mind does not interpret this moment as danger or safety. It simply observes, suspended in a state of quiet uncertainty. Minutes pass without change. There is no visible confirmation of anything occurring, yet perception remains fully engaged. The environment does not shift in appearance, but it feels different in experience. Eventually, as before, the intensity begins to fade, not through resolution, but through exhaustion. The mind can no longer maintain focus at this level. The edges of perception soften. Structure dissolves gradually. Everything becomes less defined, less immediate, less distinct. Sleep returns once again, deeper, heavier, more complete, and the night continues without interruption until eventually the first faint signs of morning begin to appear. Light slowly enters the space, transforming darkness into shape and structure. The transition is gradual but undeniable. Shadows lose depth. Objects regain definition. The room becomes familiar once again. The fire is reduced to ash and faint warmth. One by one, people begin to wake. Movement returns. Sound returns. The structure of daily life reassembles itself with practiced ease. Everything appears unchanged, stable, and ordinary, as it always does at dawn. And yet, as always, there is a quiet moment between sleep and full awareness where attention briefly pauses. Not a memory, not a thought, just a feeling that the night, once again, was not entirely empty, and that somewhere beneath the certainty of daylight, something remains quietly unresolved, waiting for the return of darkness once more. As another day fully settles into motion, the medieval household resumes its familiar rhythm with the same certainty that has guided countless generations. The morning light spreads evenly across the space, revealing everything in clear, stable detail. There is no ambiguity in the environment now, only structure and predictability. Life continues forward, as it always has, uninterrupted and orderly. The first hours of the day are marked by steady activity. Fire is rekindled, food is prepared, and tasks are assigned and completed without hesitation. Every movement follows a pattern that feels deeply familiar, shaped not by conscious thought, but by repetition over time. The world outside the house mirrors this same continuity, filled with the sounds of labor and routine life. Within this normality, there is a quiet consistency in human behavior that goes unnoticed most of the time. Small pauses between actions, brief moments of stillness while thinking, short silences in conversation that are not filled. These subtle patterns exist naturally within the flow of the day, yet they sometimes carry a faint impression of something unspoken. As the morning continues, the house itself feels entirely ordinary. Walls, doors, objects, and spaces are all clearly defined under daylight. There is no sense of uncertainty or depth beyond what is physically present. Everything appears stable, grounded, and fully understood within the limits of perception. Yet experience is not limited to what is visible. As midday approaches, the household becomes fully engaged in its daily responsibilities. Work is steady and continuous, with no interruptions in rhythm. The sun is high, The environment is bright, and there is a sense of consistency that defines the entire day. Time moves forward without resistance or irregularity. At this stage, memory of the previous night has largely dissolved into abstraction. It no longer exists as a structured sequence of events, but rather as scattered impressions that do not form a complete picture. The mind naturally organizes experience in this way, simplifying what is unclear so that attention can remain focused on the present. As the afternoon begins, the quality of light slowly changes. It softens, becoming less direct, and shadows begin to lengthen across the ground. This shift signals the gradual return of evening, though it is still distant. The transition is subtle but familiar, recognized without needing to be consciously acknowledged. With this change comes a quiet shift in behavior. Tasks begin to conclude earlier than usual. Movements become slightly more deliberate. Silence between actions grows a little longer. These adjustments are not caused by fear or expectation, but by repetition, by a cycle experienced so many times that it has become instinctive. The approach of night influences behavior long before darkness actually arrives. Inside the house, preparation for the evening begins again. Firewood is gathered and arranged. The hearth is checked and readied. Everything is done in a calm, efficient manner without discussion or urgency. The cycle continues, shaped by habit rather than instruction. As evening deepens, the transformation becomes more noticeable. Light changes in quality, becoming warmer and less defined. Shadows stretch further and gradually reclaim space within the environment. The boundary between day and night becomes increasingly clear. Inside, the fire is lit once again. Flames rise steadily, restoring structure and definition to the room. Warmth spreads through the space, creating a contained environment that feels momentarily complete. Darkness gathers at the edges, but it is held back by the presence of light. Dinner is taken quietly, with the same simplicity as before. Food is shared and consumed without ceremony. Conversation remains minimal, not due to discomfort, but due to familiarity. The structure of the evening is well established and requires no explanation. As night fully arrives, the household begins its transition into rest. Sleeping areas are prepared, and bodies gradually settle into stillness. The fire continues to burn, but in a controlled state, offering a steady presence against the growing darkness outside. Sleep begins its familiar sequence. First, relaxation of the body, then fatting of thought, then gradual loss of awareness. The room becomes quieter with each passing moment, until only breathing remains as the primary sound. Time loses structure once again, and the night resumes its familiar state of stillness. The first sleep passes without interruption, but as always, it does not remain uninterrupted. Awareness returns slowly, without force or alarm. transition is gradual, as though rising from a deeper layer of rest. The room is dark, unchanged, and familiar. The fire is reduced to faint embers. The sleeping figures remain still. At first, everything appears normal, yet perception is once again subtly heightened. Silence feels layered rather than empty, as if it contains depth beyond simple absence of sound. The mind does not actively search for meaning, but it remains quietly attentive. Then once again, something shifts. It is not a sound. It is not visible movement. It is instead a change in the quality of stillness itself. Something about the environment feels slightly altered, though nothing concrete confirms it. Attention naturally moves toward familiar points, the doorway, the corners, the darker areas of the room. Nothing appears different. Nothing confirms the sensation. And yet, the sensation persists without evidence. Time becomes unstable again. There is no clear sense of progression, only continuation. Awareness remains suspended between observation and uncertainty, unable to fully resolve either state. The fire weakens further, reducing visibility to near darkness. Shapes lose clarity. Boundaries blur. The room feels both familiar and slightly distant, as though experienced through a thin separation that cannot be crossed. Eventually, as before, the intensity begins to fade, not through resolution, but through exhaustion. The mind can no longer sustain focus at this level. The edges of perception soften. Structure dissolves gradually. Everything becomes less defined. Sleep returns once again, deeper, heavier, more complete, and the night continues without interruption until morning arrives. When it does, everything once again becomes ordinary in appearance. The house remains unchanged. The world remains stable. Life resumes its rhythm. But beneath this stability, there is always a faint, lingering impression, something that cannot be fully described, yet never completely disappears. And so the cycle continues. Day into night, night into day, each repetition familiar, each repetition slightly different in feeling, and each one carrying, quietly, the same unresolved sense of something just beyond understanding. As another evening settles over the medieval household, the familiar rhythm of preparation begins almost instinctively, as if the entire day has been slowly moving toward this moment without needing conscious direction. The light outside has softened into warm tones that gradually dissolve into deeper shades, and with every passing minute, the boundary between day and night becomes more pronounced. Inside the house, movement becomes slightly more focused. Tasks that were once casual during daylight now carry a quiet sense of completion. Firewood is gathered, stored, and arranged near the hearth. Water is brought in small containers. Every action follows a pattern that has been repeated so many times that it requires no explanation, only execution. The fire is lit earlier than the darkness fully arrives, as if anticipating what is already known. Flames grow steadily, establishing themselves as the center of the room once again. The glow spreads across the interior, giving structure to objects and defining the space in a way that daylight never quite needs to. Shadows begin to form at the edges, but they remain controlled for now. Dinner takes place under this steady light. Food is simple and familiar, eaten without distraction. Conversations are brief and practical, often ending before they fully develop into anything deeper. There is no tension in the room, but there is a shared awareness that exists beneath the surface of interaction, something unspoken yet consistently present. Outside, the world continues its transformation into night. The sky darkens completely, and the surroundings lose their visible structure. What once felt like distance now feels like absence. The land beyond the house is no longer something that can be mentally mapped or clearly imagined. It simply fades into uncertainty. Inside, the fire becomes increasingly important as night approaches fully. Its light defines the room, giving it shape and presence. Without it, everything would quickly dissolve into indistinct darkness. The reliance on this single source of stability becomes more noticeable as the contrast between inside and outside grows stronger. As the night fully settles, the household transitions into rest earlier than before. Sleeping areas are prepared in a quiet, efficient manner. Movements slow down naturally, not from exhaustion, but from familiarity with the cycle itself. There is no discussion or hesitation, only quiet alignment with a rhythm that has existed for as long as memory allows. Sleep begins its gradual descent. First, the slowing of motion, then the softening of awareness, then the steady withdrawal into unconsciousness. The room becomes quieter with each passing moment. The fire continues to burn, but more faintly now, its presence reduced to a soft, stable glow that barely reaches the far corners of the space. Breathing becomes the only consistent sound, shared but unnoticed. The first sleep passes without interruption, but as always, it does not remain uninterrupted. Awareness returns once again, not abruptly, but gradually, as though rising from beneath layers of depth. The room is dark, unchanged, and familiar. The fire is reduced to faint embers. The sleeping figures remain in place, undisturbed and still. At first, everything appears normal, yet perception is once again slightly heightened. Silence feels structured, almost layered, as if it carries more than simple absence of sound. The mind does not actively search for meaning, but it remains quietly attentive, existing in a state of passive awareness. Then once again, something shifts, not clearly defined, not directly observable, but present in the way stillness itself behaves. A subtle alteration in the quality of the environment that cannot be fully explained, though it is immediately felt. Attention naturally moves toward familiar points, the the doorway, the darker corners of the room, the edges where light no longer reaches. Nothing appears different. Nothing confirms the sensation. And yet, the sensation remains present without needing confirmation. Time becomes unstable again. There is no sense of progression, only continuation. Awareness exists in a suspended condition between observation and uncertainty, unable to fully resolve either direction. The fire weakens further, reducing visibility to near complete darkness. Shapes lose clarity. Boundaries dissolve. The room feels both familiar and slightly distant, as though experienced through a thin separation that cannot be crossed. Then a subtle change occurs. It is not sudden nor dramatic, but noticeable in the way silence feels heavier than before. Not louder, not different in sound, but denser in presence. As if the absence of sound itself has gained weight within the space, the body remains motionless. There is no reaction beyond awareness. The mind does not interpret this moment as danger or safety. It simply observes, suspended in quiet uncertainty. Minutes pass without change. No visible confirmation of anything occurring exists, yet perception remains fully engaged. The environment does not shift in appearance, but it feels different in experience. Eventually, as before, the intensity begins to fade, not through resolution, but through exhaustion. The mind can no longer maintain focus at this level. The edges of perception soften. Structure dissolves gradually. Everything becomes less defined, less immediate, less distinct. Sleep returns once again, deeper, heavier, more complete, and the night continues without interruption, until eventually the first faint signs of morning begin to appear. A subtle light enters the space, slowly transforming darkness into shape and structure. The transition is gradual but undeniable. Shadows lose depth. Objects regain definition. The room becomes familiar once more. The fire is reduced to ash and faint warmth. One by one, people begin to wake. Movement returns. Sound returns. The structure of daily life reassembles itself with practiced ease. Everything appears unchanged, stable, and ordinary, as it always does at dawn. And yet, as always, there is a quiet moment between sleep and full awareness, where something lingers just beneath recognition. Not a memory, not a thought, only a feeling that the night, once again, was not entirely empty, and that somewhere beyond explanation, something continues to exist within the cycle, quiet, unseen, and always returning with the darkness. As another morning spreads across the medieval household, the world once again returns to its familiar structure of clarity and certainty. The light is steady, filling every corner of the space and removing the ambiguity that darkness once created. Everything feels grounded in simplicity, as though the night had never altered perception at all. Daily life resumes with quiet efficiency. The fire is rekindled, water is fetched, and tools are prepared for work. Each task follows the same rhythm that has been repeated countless times before. There is no hesitation in movement, no uncertainty in action, only the smooth continuation of routine that defines the day. Yet beneath this normal rhythm, something subtle remains. It is not a clear memory. It is not a defined image. It is more like a faint impression that occasionally surfaces in moments of stillness. An awareness that the night carried something just beyond ordinary understanding, even if no direct evidence remains. As the morning continues, the household becomes fully active. Work is steady, coordinated, and familiar. The outside world mirrors this rhythm, filled with movement and sound that reinforce the stability of the present moment. Everything feels consistent, predictable, and unchanged. The house itself, under daylight, appears entirely ordinary. Walls are solid, objects are defined, and every space is clearly visible. There is no uncertainty in perception, no suggestion of hidden depth. Everything exists exactly as it should within the structure of daylight. Still, human awareness is not limited to what is visible. There are brief moments throughout the morning when attention drifts unexpectedly. A pause during work, a moment of silence between conversations, a glance that lingers slightly longer than necessary toward a familiar space. These moments are subtle, but they carry a faint echo of something unspoken. By midday, the household is fully immersed in its daily rhythm. The sun is strong, the environment is bright, and there is a sense of stability that defines the entire day. Time moves forward smoothly, without interruption or irregularity. Life continues in its expected pattern. At this stage, the memory of the night has mostly dissolved into abstraction. It no longer exists as a structured sequence of events, but rather as scattered impressions that do not form a complete picture. The mind naturally simplifies experience, allowing attention to remain focused on immediate reality. As the afternoon begins, the quality of light gradually changes. It softens, becoming less direct, and shadows begin to lengthen across the ground. This shift marks the slow return of evening, though it is still distant. The transition is subtle but familiar. With this change comes a quiet adjustment in behavior. Tasks begin to conclude earlier. Movements become slightly more deliberate. Silence between actions becomes more noticeable. These changes are not driven by conscious thought, but by repetition. The cycle of day and night has shaped behavior so consistently that it now operates almost instinctively. Inside the house, preparation for evening begins again. Firewood is gathered and arranged. The hearth is checked. Everything is done calmly, without urgency or discussion. The cycle continues with practiced familiarity, as it always has. As evening deepens, the transformation becomes more visible. Light changes in quality, becoming warmer and less defined. Shadows stretch further and gradually reclaim space within the environment. The boundary between day and night becomes increasingly clear once again. Inside, the fire is lit. Flames rise steadily, restoring structure and definition to the room. Warmth spreads throughout the space, creating a contained environment that feels temporarily complete. Darkness gathers at the edges, but it is held back by the presence of light. Dinner is taken quietly, as usual. Food is simple, shared, and consumed without ceremony. Conversation remains minimal, not due to discomfort, but due to familiarity. The structure of the evening is well established and requires no explanation. As night fully arrives, the household begins its transition into rest. Sleeping areas are prepared, and bodies gradually settle into stillness. The fire remains active but controlled, offering a steady presence against the growing darkness outside. Sleep begins its familiar sequence. First, relaxation of the body, then fatting of thought, then gradual loss of awareness. The room becomes quieter with each passing moment, until only breathing remains as the primary sound. Time loses structure once again, and the night resumes its familiar state of stillness. The first sleep passes without interruption, but as always, it does not remain uninterrupted. Awareness returns again, slowly and without force. The transition is gradual, as though rising from a deeper layer of rest. The room is dark, unchanged, and familiar. The fire is reduced to faint embers. The sleeping figures remain still. At first, everything appears normal, yet perception is once again subtly heightened. Silence feels layered rather than empty, as if it contains depth beyond simple absence of sound. The mind does not actively search for meaning, but it remains quietly attentive. Then once again, something shifts. It is not a sound. It is not visible movement. It is instead a change in the quality of stillness itself. Something about the environment feels slightly altered, though nothing concrete confirms it. Attention naturally moves toward familiar points, the doorway, the corners, the darker areas of the room. Nothing appears different. Nothing confirms the sensation. And yet, the sensation persists without evidence. It continues without resolution. Time becomes unstable again. There is no clear sense of progression, only continuation. Awareness remains suspended between observation and uncertainty, unable to fully resolve either direction. The fire weakens further, reducing visibility to near darkness. Shapes lose clarity, boundaries blur. The room feels both familiar and slightly distant, as though experienced through a thin separation that cannot be crossed. Eventually, as before, the intensity begins to fade, not through explanation, but through exhaustion. The mind can no longer sustain focus at this level, the edges of perception soften. Structure dissolves gradually. Everything becomes less defined. Sleep returns once again. Deeper, heavier, more complete, and the night continues without interruption until morning arrives. When it does, everything once again becomes ordinary in appearance. The house remains unchanged. The world remains stable. Life resumes its rhythm. But beneath this stability, there is always something faint that lingers, an impression without form, a presence without definition, quietly existing at the edge of awareness, waiting for the next return of darkness. As another evening approaches in the medieval household, there is a quiet familiarity in the way everything begins to slow down, as if the entire day is gently releasing its hold on the world. The light outside is softer now, no longer sharp or demanding, but instead stretching long and thin across the land. Shadows begin to form early, creeping slowly into corners that had been fully visible only moments before. Inside the house, movement becomes more intentional. People complete their remaining tasks with calm efficiency, not rushing, but not delaying either. Firewood is gathered and placed near the hearth. Water is stored, and small preparations for the night are made without discussion. Everything follows a rhythm that feels deeply embedded in daily life, shaped by repetition rather than instruction. The fire is lit earlier again, as if responding to something unspoken. Flames rise and stabilize, quickly becoming the center of the room. The warmth spreads outward, creating a familiar boundary between safety and the growing darkness outside. Shadows appear at the edges, but they remain controlled, held back by the steady glow of the hearth. Dinner takes place under this controlled light, as it always does. The food is simple and familiar, eaten without ceremony or interruption. Conversations are brief, often ending naturally without conclusion. There is no tension in the room, only a shared quiet awareness that seems to exist beneath every interaction, subtle and unspoken. Outside, the world continues its slow transformation into night. The sky loses its remaining color, deepening into uniform darkness. The land beyond the house fades completely from view, no longer something that can be clearly imagined or defined. It becomes a space of absence rather than distance. Inside, the fire takes on greater importance as night deepens. Its light defines the room, giving structure to objects and stability to perception. Without it, everything would quickly dissolve into indistinct shadow. The reliance on this single source of light becomes more noticeable as the contrast between inside and outside grows stronger. As night fully arrives, the household transitions into rest earlier than expected. Sleeping areas are prepared in quiet coordination. Movements slow naturally, not out of urgency, but out of familiarity with the cycle itself. There is no discussion, only alignment with a rhythm that has repeated countless times before. Sleep begins its gradual descent. First, the slowing of physical movement, then the softening of awareness, then the steady withdrawal into unconsciousness. The room becomes quieter with each passing moment. The fire continues to burn, but more faintly now, its glow reduced to a soft presence that barely reaches the far edges of the space. Breathing becomes the only consistent sound, shared but unnoticed. The first sleep passes without interruption, but as always, it does not remain uninterrupted. Awareness returns again, slowly and without force. The transition is gradual, as though rising from beneath layers of depth. The room is dark, unchanged, and familiar. The fire is reduced to faint embers. The sleeping figures remain still and undisturbed. At first, everything appears normal, yet perception is once again subtly heightened. Silence feels structured, almost layered, as if it contains more than simple absence of sound. The mind does not actively search for meaning, but it remains quietly attentive, existing in a state of passive awareness. Then once again, something shifts, not clearly defined, not directly observable, but present in the way stillness itself behaves. A subtle alteration in the quality of the environment that cannot be fully explained, though it is immediately felt. Attention naturally moves toward familiar points, the doorway, the corners, the darker areas of the room. Nothing appears different. Nothing confirms the sensation. And yet, the sensation persists without needing confirmation. It exists without evidence. Time becomes unstable again. There is no sense of progression, only continuation. Awareness remains suspended between observation and uncertainty, unable to fully resolve either state. The fire weakens further, reducing visibility to near complete darkness. Shapes lose clarity. Boundaries dissolve. The room feels both familiar and slightly distant, as though experienced through a thin separation that cannot be crossed. Then a subtle change occurs. It is not sudden. It is not dramatic. But it is noticeable in the way silence feels heavier than before. Not louder, not different in sound, but denser in presence. As if the absence of sound itself has gained weight within the space. The body remains motionless. There is no reaction beyond awareness. The mind does not interpret this moment as danger or safety. It simply observes, suspended in quiet uncertainty. Minutes pass without change. No visible confirmation of anything occurring exists, yet perception remains fully engaged. The environment does not shift in appearance, but it feels different in experience. Eventually, as before, the intensity begins to fade, not through resolution, but through exhaustion. The mind can no longer maintain focus at this level. The edges of perception soften. Structure dissolves gradually. Everything becomes less defined, less immediate, less distinct. Sleep returns once again, deeper, heavier, more complete, and the night continues, without interruption, until eventually the first faint signs of morning begin to appear. A subtle light enters the space, slowly transforming darkness into shape and structure. The transition is gradual but undeniable. Shadows lose depth. Objects regain definition. The room becomes familiar once more. The fire is reduced to ash and faint warmth. One by one, people begin to wake. Movement returns. Sound returns. The structure of daily life reassembles itself with practiced ease. Everything appears unchanged, stable, and ordinary, as it always does at dawn. And yet, as always, there is a quiet moment between sleep and full awareness, where something lingers just beneath recognition. Not a memory, not a thought, only a feeling that the night, once again, was not entirely empty. As the final morning of this long cycle arrives in the medieval household, there is a strange sense of continuity that feels both familiar and slightly heavier than before. The light enters the space in its usual gentle way, revealing everything in clear, stable detail. Yet something about the atmosphere feels subtly different, as if the accumulated weight of many nights has quietly settled into the environment itself. The household wakes as it always does. Fire is rekindled, water is brought in, and daily tasks begin without delay. Movements are smooth and practiced, shaped by repetition over countless days. Everything appears normal on the surface, yet there is a faint sense of reflection in the way people carry themselves, as if their awareness of routine has deepened without them realizing it. The house is once again fully defined by daylight. Walls are firm, objects are ordinary, and every space is clearly visible. There is no shadow of uncertainty now, no suggestion of hidden depth or unseen presence. The structure of reality feels complete, stable, and unbroken under the strength of morning light. And yet, even in this clarity, something remains at the edge of awareness. It is not fear. It is not memory. It is something quieter, an impression that the nights were never truly empty, even when nothing could be seen or confirmed. This impression does not take shape as thought, but as a feeling that briefly surfaces and then fades again during moments of stillness. As the day continues, life resumes its familiar rhythm. Work is carried out, conversations happen, and time moves forward without interruption. The world outside the house is active and continuous, reinforcing the sense that everything is stable and unchanged. The past night becomes increasingly distant, dissolving into the background of daily existence. By midday, the memory of the entire cycle feels softened. It is no longer something sharp or clearly defined, but something abstract and fragmented. The mind naturally simplifies what it cannot fully hold, turning complex experiences into vague impressions that no longer demand attention. As the afternoon arrives, light begins to shift once again. Shadows grow longer, colors soften, and the world slowly prepares for the return of evening. This transition is subtle but inevitable, marking the beginning of another descent into night. The cycle does not pause, it only turns. With this change, behavior adjusts once more. Tasks are completed earlier. Movements become more deliberate. Silence between actions grows slightly longer. These shifts are not conscious decisions, but reflections of a rhythm that has shaped life for so long that it now exists beneath awareness itself. The approach of night influences behavior long before darkness actually arrives. Inside the house, preparation begins again. Firewood is gathered, stored, and arranged. The hearth is checked and prepared without discussion. Everything follows the same familiar sequence, as though repetition itself has become a form of understanding. As evening deepens, the transformation becomes visible once again. Light fades, shadows extend, and the boundary between day and night becomes clear. The outside world gradually disappears into darkness, while the interior of the house becomes the center of all perception. The fire is lit once more. Flames rise steadily, bringing warmth and definition back into the room. The glow restores structure to objects and space, creating a temporary sense of enclosure and safety. Darkness gathers at the edges, but it remains held back by the presence of light. Dinner is taken quietly, as always. Food is simple, shared, and consumed without ceremony. Conversation remains minimal, not due to tension, but due to familiarity. The structure of the evening no longer requires explanation. As night fully arrives, the household transitions into rest. Sleeping areas are prepared, and bodies settle into stillness. The fire continues to burn, but in a reduced and controlled state, maintaining a fragile balance against the surrounding darkness. Sleep begins its familiar descent. First, relaxation, then fading awareness, then complete surrender to unconsciousness. The room becomes quieter with each passing moment. Breathing becomes the only consistent presence. Time loses structure again, and the night resumes its familiar silence. The first sleep passes without interruption, but as always, it does not remain uninterrupted. Awareness returns once more, slowly and gently, as though rising from a deeper place within rest. The room is dark, unchanged, and familiar. The fire is reduced to faint embers. The sleeping figures remain still. At first, everything appears ordinary, yet perception is once again subtly heightened. Silence feels layered, almost structured, as if it contains depth beyond absence. The mind does not search, but it remains quietly attentive. Then, for the final time, something shifts, not clearly defined, not visibly confirmed, but present in the way stillness itself feels slightly different from before. A quiet alteration in the quality of the environment that cannot be fully explained. Attention moves instinctively toward familiar points, the doorway, the corners, the edges of the room. Nothing appears changed. Nothing confirms the sensation. And yet, the sensation exists without needing confirmation. There is no resolution, only continuation. Time becomes unclear once again. Awareness exists in a suspended state between observation and uncertainty. The fire weakens further, and the room fades into near total darkness. Shapes lose definition. Boundaries dissolve. The space feels both familiar and distant at the same time, as if it is being experienced through something thin and invisible. And then, slowly, the intensity begins to fade, not through understanding, not through discovery, but through exhaustion, as awareness can no longer sustain itself at this depth. The edges of perception soften. The structure of experience dissolves. Everything becomes less distinct, less immediate, less defined. Sleep returns for the final time. Deeper, heavier, complete, and the night, in its final repetition, continues without interruption until morning arrives once again. When it does, everything is ordinary. The house is unchanged. The world is stable. Life continues as it always has. But something subtle remains, not as a story, not as a memory, but as a quiet understanding that the boundary between night and day is not as simple as it appears. And with that realization, the cycle does not end.